Greetings. My name is Dr. Piers Robinson. I'm the Research Director and Board Member of the International Centre for 9/11 Justice and also co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies. And it's with great pleasure that I am hosting today's symposium, Aviation Impossibilities, Deconstruction of the Official Story of the 9/11 Hijackings and Air Defence Failures. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with IC911, we're an organization who've been established in order to educate the public about the truth of 9/11. We are also established in order to conduct groundbreaking research into 9/11 and other related issues. And we're also involved in supporting families of victims of 9/11 in their pursuit of justice in relation to what happened on those days, on 9/11. Now, the focus of our presentation or our symposium today is on aviation aspects of the 9/11 event. Now, much work over the last 20 years conducted by the 9/11 research community has focused upon the building destructions in New York. And a lot of high quality and very rigorous work has been produced, which has given us a very detailed understanding of the truth of what happened to those buildings on 9/11. And really throughout that time, that has been an understandable focus, I think, of the research community in relation to 9/11. But there's also been, from really very early on, many questions raised about the aviation aspects of 9/11, what happened in the skies. And these long-standing questions and doubts, which this symposium and IC911 is now going to try to explore, some of these kind of initial concerns are set out very clearly in this very interesting clip of Lieutenant Colonel David Gapp, who was a US Air Force pilot. And I'd like to just give a little bit of time just to play this clip from David Gapp so you can get a sense of the kind of issues and the kind of concerns that people have had about what happened in the skies on 9/11. And it's a pointer to some of the issues that our presenters, who I'll introduce in a minute, will be talking about during this presentation. So if we can just watch, if we can play the clip now of David Gapp speaking, please.
My name is Dave Gapp, and I'm a retired U.S. Air Force pilot with 31 years service in the Air Force. I just retired in late 2009 with a background in flying fighter aircraft, as well as a graduate of the Air Force's Flight Safety Course. I'm an experienced aircraft accident investigator, as well as Safety Board President. One of the many professional organizations that is proud to question the official U.S. government's version of the events of September 11, 2001 is being announced today, Military Officers for 9/11 Truth. It now has over 300 founding members and can be found at militaryofficersfor911truth.org. In my professional opinion as an aviator, I have the following concerns, which I would like to entitle Aviation Improbabilities. Now, I'm not saying that these are impossible to happen as individual occurrences, but that it is highly improbable that they would all occur in a series to have the outcome as professed by the U.S. government. The improbability of all 8 airline pilots voluntarily giving up control of their aircraft to individuals stating that they have box cutters and have or will kill passengers. This is not established protocol to give up control of the aircraft and responsibility of safety for all your passengers and crew. The improbability of all 8 airline pilots being killed without a deliberate, violent flight control reaction that would upend any cockpit invasion. The improbability of all 8 airline pilots not entering the hijack or emergency code into the transponders, alerting air traffic control of a serious problem. The improbability, if the above events occurred, that the marginally trained hijackers would be able to operate the navigational systems necessary and fly to specific points in airspace using instrument flight rules. The improbability of maneuvering the airliners above 400 knots airspeed, which is considered high speed, and precisely striking comparatively small World Trade Center 1 and 2. Professional pilots and simulators have about a 1 in 3 chance of accomplishing this maneuver. Improbability of maneuvering American Airlines Flight 77 from 35,000 feet descending to hit the Pentagon, as stated by the U.S. government in an analysis of the flight data recorder. Specifically, a 330-degree turn from 7,000 feet, descending at a controlled airspeed of 290 to 300 knots airspeed to precisely strike the Pentagon at ground level by a minimally trained, unqualified hijacker. As a military fighter pilot, I have questions as to why numerous air defense systems were not utilized that day, including intercept aircraft that had plenty of time from 8:14 a.m. when Boston Center air traffic controllers realized something was wrong with American Airlines Flight 11 after it did not respond to authorization to change flight levels. There were 3 air defense exercises ongoing on September 11th, and their command posts and chain of commands were fully staffed. Otis Air Force Base, Massachusetts had Air National Guard F-15 fighter interceptors nearby, which were airborne too late at 8:53. Flight 11 hit the North Tower at 8:45 a.m., followed by Flight 175 hitting the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. Many other bases, including Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, D.C., and Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, have fighters on alert or available. Why did none of them launch in time to intercept Flight 77, as it did not strike until 9:37 a.m.? Finally, as an experienced aircraft investigator, I have serious questions regarding several of the crash sites. Again, it is improbable that of the 8 black boxes, in reality, a bright orange flight data recorder and a bright orange cockpit voice recorder on each of the aircraft, only the flight data recorder from Flight 77 into the Pentagon and both recorders from Flight 93 in Pennsylvania were recovered. With over 1.5 million man-hours of time sorting through debris at the Fresh Kills site in New Jersey, it is improbable that we don't have more aircraft evidence of what actually occurred in each of the unfortunate airliners that day. Thank you again for your time and consideration of these facts.
Thank you, Mike. So it is with these questions in mind that IC911 has decided to embark upon research into the aviation aspects of 9/11. And certainly over time, we will build, and we intend to build, an authoritative research-based account analysis of what happened in the skies that day, aiming to mirror, in a way, I hope, the depth and the quality and the rigor of the analysis which has been carried out on the building destructions in New York, and ultimately shine a spotlight on the truth of what happened in the skies that day. Now, today's speakers who are going to be presenting their work, we have 4 fantastic presentations. We have, first off, we will have Ted Walter, who is the Executive Director of IC911, who has worked extensively on the issue of 9/11 for many, many years now. And he's going to be focusing in his presentation on exposing the myth of the 9/11 hijackings, examining the official story and the history of suicide hijacking attempts, and also looking at the content of the phone calls which were purportedly made from the aircraft on 9/11. We'll then have Olivier Caron-Mason, who is a pilot and flight instructor, who's going to be talking about the feasibility of inexperienced pilots having carried out the maneuvers that we see on 9/11. We then have Aidan Monaghan, who is a researcher on 9/11. He's published articles in the Journal of 9/11 Studies, and he's going to be looking closely at the feasibility of remote guidance, GPS-guided autopilot control of the aircraft which crashed on 9/11. And then finally, last but by no means least, we have Kevin Ryan. He's editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies, author of Another 19, and also board member of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. And he's going to be taking a forensic look at the air defense failures on 9/11. So this is the range of talks which we'll be having today, which I hope you will find very fascinating. And there's great detail there. These will be up online following the presentations, so people can go back again and again. So there's a lot of detail in these presentations. People will learn a lot from them, I believe. But before we do, it is I'm very proud, it's my honor to introduce retired Captain Dan Hanley, just to say a few words. Now, Dan Hanley, for those of you who are not familiar with him, he is a former US Navy aviator. He has 10 years flying in the US Navy. He was a United Airlines pilot for 25 years. So he's got a 35-year flying career experience. And he's also the director of 9/11 Pilot Whistleblowers. And Dan has been kind enough to join just to say a few words about the symposium we're having today and to talk a little bit about his own work and efforts to bring some justice and truth to what happened in the skies that day. Dan, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. I was muted there for the invitation to speak briefly today. I appreciate it very much. You mentioned my flight credentials. I normally mention them on programs I come on, not to boast about my accomplishments in aviation, but to make the statement that with my experience, I could not have flown the 9/11 flight profiles, and neither could these alleged Muslim hijackers because they were not qualified in the airplane and they were too inexperienced. There's 300,000 roughly pilots in the world today who will agree with that assessment I just made. But unfortunately, none of us had the opportunity to testify before the 9/11 Commission because of one man, Philip Zelikow, the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, who prevented any pilots from testifying as to the absurdity of this ludicrous notion that these hijackers flew the aircraft. You mentioned our organization, 9/11 Pilot Whistleblowers. A group of us got together several years ago because the pilots haven't had a voice and decided to create this global grassroots organization called 9/11 Pilot Whistleblowers. And we got a website at 911pilots.org. It's not just our membership is not just restricted to pilots, but it's also open to the general public, and you can join us on the website. I serve as a director and public spokesperson for this group, but I want to point out that there's roughly 1.9 billion Muslims in the world who have been persecuted the last 23 years based on the lies of 9/11 that Muslim hijackers had control of the aircraft, and their religion has been demonized. And the purpose of 9/11 Whistleblowers, the primary purpose, is to hopefully exonerate the Muslim population from any wrongdoing on 9/11. And we want to do that by showing that these hijackers weren't qualified to fly the airplanes, but that these aircraft were electronically hijacked and remotely controlled through employment of a system called the uninterruptible autopilot that enables a remote source to take complete control of an aircraft's autopilot and fly it to its selected, its target destination. Now, once the system is engaged, the pilots can no longer disconnect it. I'll talk in a little bit about remote control, but one of the goals of our organization has been to recruit highly trained and experienced pilots, whether they're active or retired, military or civilian, from around the world, and we have been successful in doing that, and we've got their testimony on tape where they state not only could the hijackers not have flown the airplanes, but that they could not have flown them themselves. Those interviews are on our website also on the drop-down menu under pilot interviews. But that's been our goal, and we've been successful at it. But to switch over to remote control aircraft, there may be some people that might be challenged to believe that you can remotely control a large commercial jet aircraft. Well, let me take you back 80 years ago when, towards the end of World War II in 1944, the U.S. Army Air Corps launched Operation Aphrodite out of the UK, where they took old B-17 bombers and gutted them out to lighten away the aircraft so they could load them up with 30,000 pounds, which is a highly incendiary compound. Pilots were required to make the takeoff, but once they got airborne, they bailed out of the aircraft and these aircraft were remotely guided at targets in Europe. Now, this was 80 years ago. We were flying remote controlled aircraft. There's a number of other examples I could cite, but due to time constraints, I won't. But I'll jump ahead to 40 years later, in 1984, 17 years before 9/11, NASA and the FAA conducted a joint crash test experiment in a remote location where they took a 4-engine commercial jet airliner, a Boeing 720, loaded it up with crash dummies and cameras because they wanted to test crew and passenger survivability in the event of a crash landing. The aircraft was flown remotely around the pattern several times before it was intentionally crash landed. So that's just another example of remote control. Now, if you jump ahead to the mid-90s, we assert that this is when the uninterruptible autopilot was developed and produced. There's actually a Wikipedia article that's entitled Boeing Honeywell Uninterruptible Autopilot, and it's somewhat misleading. It says that its stated design purpose is to prevent would-be hijackers from commandeering a commercial jet aircraft in flight by remotely taking control of the aircraft autopilot and flying the aircraft to one of 108 airports in the world to safely auto-land it. So it's basically advertised as an anti-hijacking device to prevent hijackers from getting hold of an airplane. But the misleading part is, in the article, it says Boeing patented this system in 2006. Well, that's 5 years after 9/11. And this is true. We do have a copy of the patent. It was in November 2006. But we've had informants come forward, both in the civilian sector and the military and otherwise, who have stated they either worked on it or were familiar because they had inside information on this system. So we know it was developed and produced prior to 9/11, and 9/11 Pilot Whistleblowers, after I talk about a hijacker here in a minute, contends that it necessarily had to have been employed on 9/11 for the aircraft to have hit their targets with such precision on their first attempt. So let me jump to one hijacker I'm just going to target in on because it proves my point, and that is 29-year-old Saudi Arabian hijacker Hani Hanjour, who supposedly piloted American 77 into the Pentagon. He came to the States in the mid-90s and took some flight training in light single-engine prop-driven aircraft before returning to Saudi Arabia. Now, it's been well documented that he was a poor student. The New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, ABC News, and other news outlets all reported he was a very weak and poor student. Well, when he returned to the States prior to 9/11 and wanted to enroll in a school that he attended before, and the school wouldn't take him because they didn't want to waste assets on him because he was such a poor student. So in the tape you just saw, Mr. Gaff talking about it, the maneuver he performed was this descending, accelerating corkscrew turn out of 7,000 feet just west of the Pentagon to arrive precisely at the surface. And this is the trick to the maneuver: to be at that speed of almost 500 miles per hour, just a few feet off the surface without skidding it, and hit the Office of Naval Intelligence on his first attempt. This is performed supposedly by this poor student. Well, the same maneuver was replicated in a simulator and flown by highly experienced pilots. There was another grassroots group called Pilots for 9/11 Truth, and the pilots would crash the simulator while attempting this maneuver. So, and we've been led to believe Hani Hanjour did it on his first attempt, but the story gets better. Hani Hanjour goes to the Freeway Airport in Bowie, Maryland, 1 month prior to 9/11 and wants to rent a Cessna 172. Well, when you go into a fixed-base operator like that, they don't just throw you the keys to the airplane and say, have fun. You've got to go up on an evaluation flight if they don't know you to prove you can fly. Well, Hanjour didn't just go up on one flight over a 2-day period. He went up on 3 check rides, and he flunked all 3. And I talked to the chief flight instructor at the airport who declined rental of the aircraft because he couldn't fly. And he confirmed the story for me. So what did Hanjo do? 3 days later, he goes down the road to another fixed base operator, Congressional Air Charter, and goes up flying with a man named Eddie Shalev, who came back and said he was a good student. Well, the FBI and the 9/11 Commission staff went out and interrogated all 4 of these pilots, the 3 at Freeway Airport and the 1 at Congressional Air Charter. And what appeared in the 9/11 Commission final report? Only Eddie Shalev's testimony that he was a good pilot. And it just appeared as an end note. None of this was taken under oath. And Eddie Shalev's name was just mentioned once. So I'm losing my train of thought here. Oh, the FBI and the 9/11 Commission suppressed this key evidence on Hani Hanjo. Basically, the guy couldn't fly, and it was suppressed by the FBI and 9/11 Commission. And that's why we say the only viable alternative explanation as to how American 77 hit the Pentagon was through employment of this uninterruptible autopilot system. Another reason I'm happy that I was invited to this symposium to briefly speak before the keynote speakers come out here and talk is I received a packet of information from the International Center for 9/11 Justice. It was a series of papers written by one of the other speakers on the panel, Chevalier Caron, I'm messing up his name, Mason. But what he did, and I'm not going to steal his thunder here, was phenomenal work in that he showed the skill set and knowledge needed for each of these hijackers to have performed the maneuvers that they did. So his work complements and supports everything we're doing at 9/11 Pilot Whistleblowers. And it's superb what he's done, and we appreciate the effort. And the other person I'd like to thank is another person on the panel and a friend of mine, Aidan Monaghan, who did the work on the remote control aircraft technology. I've heard his presentation before. He did a lot of Freedom of Information Act work, and for both those gents, we appreciate your effort at 9/11 Pilot Whistleblowers. As far as I go, if you want to get a hold of me, if you want additional information on me, or would like to interview me on a podcast or whatever, I'm on Twitter at Dan Hanley 4 and on Facebook at Dan Hanley. And I'd like to thank again the International Center for 9/11 Justice for allowing me to speak here today. And I'll hand it back to you, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that introduction and discussion also of Olivier's work, which people will be hearing after Ted Walter. That's great, and we wish you all the best with your efforts, and we hope going forward that we'll see sort of greater and greater success in terms of awareness about these key aspects on what happened on 9/11 in the skies. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson.
Okay, so we shall now, without further ado, move to our first presentation, and I'm very pleased to welcome colleague and friend, Ted Walter. He's the Executive Director of International Center for 9/11 Justice, and he has worked for many years on issues related to 9/11, as he used to work for architects and engineers for 9/11. And his presentation today is going to be going into a lot of detail on the kind of key claims being made in the official story about the supposed hijacking of the aircraft, and also critically the content of the phone calls. So it's a great pleasure to have you presenting, Ted, and I know you've got quite a few slides to get through. So without further ado, I shall hand over to you, Ted.
Thank you very much, Piers, and thank you Dan, for your remarks, and thank you to UK Column for hosting the symposium with us. And thank you to everyone who's watching this presentation. It's really an honor to be sharing this information with you. The first thing I want to say is that this is very much a research project in progress. I actually only started studying the reported hijacking events and the phone calls, which are reported, describe the hijacking events, about 6 months ago. And I've done a lot. I spent a lot on it in that 6 months, but it's still pretty new for me, and I'm learning things every day. And I'm also kind of figuring out how to talk about this topic. It's really this is the first public presentation I'm giving on it. So I really welcome and encourage people to give feedback, give input. If you're out there and there's something that you know that I don't know that I didn't present, please feel free to contact the center. You can go to our website, IC911.org. There's a contact us page there. You can also email us at info@IC911.org. As Piers mentioned, I have a lot of slides to get through, so I'm going to try to move fairly quickly. I've got about 75 minutes to go through, brace yourself, about 120 slides, but I think it can be done. And a lot of the slides we will breeze through, and we're going to skip a portion of them. We're going to skip a portion of those slides, and I will put this PowerPoint up on the website for people to look at it who want to dig more into one part of the presentation that we're going to skip through. So with that, let me start this presentation. As you can see, I believe that it's up there on the screen. The title of the presentation is The 9/11 Hijacking Myth Exposed, Examining the Official Story Against the History of Suicide Hijacking Attempts and the Content of the 9/11 Phone Calls. Okay, so why are we studying the 9/11 hijacking story? Well, basically, I boiled down the events of 9/11, the day of 9/11 itself, to really 4 key events or 4 key claims. The first is that a set of hijackers hijacked all these airplanes. The second is that they navigated their way to their targets and flew them into their targets. And the third is that the US air defenses failed to stop them. And then the fourth is that 3 buildings in Manhattan collapsed due to these airplane impacts. And so we're, as you all know, this symposium is looking at 3 of those events. And this presentation is going to focus on the first of those events in detail. But it's really the first in this whole chain of events. And this crime that we're looking at is essentially, first and foremost, a hijacking crime, allegedly. So it's pretty darn important. And we haven't spent a lot of time focusing on it as a movement over the past 20 years. Some, but maybe not as much as we could. The second thing is that refuting this claim, the hijacking story, tells us who the perpetrators were not, that it was not these 19 men. Now, they were involved as patsies. We're not going to be getting into that, but it tells us something about who actually committed this crime. So that's pretty important. And the hijacking story can be refuted if we carefully scrutinize the only evidence that actually exists supporting it, which is the phone calls. And I'll explain why that is as we get into the presentation. I think over the past 2 decades, the 9/11 Truth Movement hasn't focused a lot on the hijacking events because it's sort of been framed as a question of plausibility. Is it really possible that these hijackers could have done this? Does it make sense? It's hard to hijack a plane, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all true in my view. But I think that the phone calls can be leveraged, and I'd like to make the case today that the phone calls actually allow us to refute this story definitively. Okay, so the working hypothesis here, if you're someone who believes that the Twin Towers in Building 7 were demolished, the logical step from that for most people would be, well, there's no way that whoever planned this event would just count on 19 young Arab men being able to hijack all these 4 planes and being able to navigate them and fly them into their targets successfully. And they would need these planes to reach their targets because they're planning on demolishing these 3 skyscrapers, and they can't allow for anything to go wrong. So the sort of assumption here, the working hypothesis, is that these men did not hijack these planes. However, we're going to kind of put aside that assumption and try to make the case just on the evidence around the phone calls and the aviation only that this story is both exceedingly improbable and based on false evidence, as I will show towards the end of the presentation. So the research question is, how probable and how supported by evidence is the violent takeover of each aircraft as reported by the 9/11 Commission? In terms of the scope, I want to be very clear about what we're not looking at today. We're not investigating the presence or lack thereof of the alleged hijackers on the airplanes. We're only looking at the reported hijacking events. We're also not investigating how the phone calls were made. The focus is going to be exclusively on what was reported in the phone calls. Now, a lot of the discourse and a lot of the research has focused on that how question, the technology of it, et cetera. How were they made? We're going to put that aside for this presentation and just focus on what was actually reported in the phone calls. What did all these people purportedly report was going on the planes? Okay, so just to walk through the outline, the first section of this presentation is going to be an overview of externally observable reported hijacking events. The second section is 9/11 Commission explanation for the success of the hijacking attempts. The third section, historical record of suicide hijacking attempts. Fourth, we're going to compare the 9/11 hijacking story with the historical record. And lastly, the phone calls, the nail in the coffin of the 9/11 hijacking story. And that's probably going to be about 40% of the presentation. So part one, overview of externally observable reported hijacking events. So the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, took off at 7:59 a.m. from Boston Logan Airport, and it was allegedly taken over at 8:13 a.m., so 14 minutes later. And you see on the map there where it was taken over. The second flight, United Airlines Flight 175, takeoff at 8:14, also from Boston Logan. The takeover allegedly happened between 8:42 and 8:46 a.m. over New Jersey. The third flight, American Airlines Flight 77, took off at 8:20 a.m. The alleged takeover was between 8:51 and 8:54 a.m. And it kind of flew directly west. I guess they're in southern Ohio when it was over southern Ohio when it was allegedly taken over. United Airlines Flight 93 took off from Newark Airport at 8:42. It was the latest to take off. It was delayed on the taxi for some time. And the alleged takeover time is at 9:28 a.m. Okay, so for the first three flights, there's actually no external indication at the moment of takeover that there was anything going on in the plane. And when I say external indication, what I mean is the pilots did not squawk the universal hijack code. There was no verbal communication from the pilots with air traffic control. And there was no sudden, uncontrolled deviation from the flight path. And this is just an example of sort of how quickly and how sort of smooth this hijacking allegedly occurred. So for American Airlines Flight 11, just 16 seconds elapsed between the crew's final radio transmission and subsequent air traffic control transmission that went unanswered. So if you look there on the right, you'll see in the log and in the NTSB report, the last message from the pilots was at 8:13, 8:31. 16 seconds later, Boston sector air traffic control contacted them again, and there was no answer. And they kept contacting them and got no answer. So in the space of that 16 seconds, the pilots were allegedly somehow incapacitated or prevented from being able to respond to air traffic control. For Flight 93, which was again the time of the alleged takeover was at 9:28 a.m. There was a 600-foot descent right around 9:28. 9:28 is a few seconds, followed by a return to cruising altitude within 2 minutes. So it did a little dip and then kind of returned back to cruising altitude. 11 seconds after the start of the descent, there were two radio transmissions, 32 seconds apart, conveying sounds of a violent cockpit struggle. Okay. Now, there are some reasons to be skeptical of these events and what they mean. None of these are things that I'm as a researcher, I'm going to hang my hat on and say, hey, this proves that the hijacking story is false. But let's not just assume that these things are what should be interpreted the way that we're meant to interpret them. So the brief 600-foot descent without a change of direction, you could argue is not really that consistent with a loss of control due to an actual cockpit struggle. Okay, and several pilots have advised me that that's the case. Didn't change direction. It just kind of dips 600 feet and went back. That can happen, with air turbulence, or the pilot kind of losing focus or something. It dips a little bit and comes back. Climbing back, the other reason to be skeptical of it is that the climb back to cruising altitude kind of started before the cockpit struggle was allegedly over. So let's look at that. But just to on that idea, while the pilots and the hijackers are fighting over the controls, they manage to steer it back to, or autopilot does it, who knows? But it's just it doesn't quite resonate. Reasons for skepticism of the actual radio transmissions. So first of all, the radio transmission can come from pretty much anywhere, at least anywhere in the sky. Somebody who's like tuned into that frequency. And when you actually listen to these, it's very odd. What you're going to hear is the pilot saying Mayday in both of these transmissions, both separate transmissions. And I think, Olivier, who's going to present next, in his view, that it's a little bit odd for Mayday to be the word that a pilot would use and not give any more information. You might say Mayday, hijacking, or just hijacking underway, or hey, but just to say Mayday is just a little odd. And for them to say it twice in two separate transmissions. The last thing is, if we listen closely to the second transmission, you will hear pretty much the exact same words repeated and the exact same set of sounds and sort of the exact same rhythm. So I'm going to play both of these for you right now.
We'll just put them in back to direct St. Louis, and they can put in whatever they want, just so we can get them off back. Marine.
Okay, so that was the first one, and then 32 seconds later, there was this second transmission.
That's American 1060.
Okay, and I'm going to play that for you again, and just listen for that sort of rhythm. Mayday, get out of here. Mayday, get out of here.
That's American 1060.
Okay. So the most important thing to draw from the transmissions is not just that they sound a little fishy, but that they establish the official story basically commits itself to a violent struggle taking place in the cockpit during the minute of 9:28. So from 9:28:05, when the descent began, until 9:28:54, which was when the second transmission ended, that's about 50 seconds. This cockpit struggle, alleged struggle, probably took place at least a minute, if not more. Okay, and the official story has committed itself to this. Whereas for the other three hijackings, we actually have no idea how the struggle, what happened, how the pilots were removed from the cockpit, etc. The official story has actually made a claim in the case of Flight 93. And this is going to be really important when we start to look at the phone calls. And I just want you to note that we're going to talk about this later, but all the passengers who made calls were originally seated in first class or in rows 10 to 12. So all very close to the front of the plane. And as you see a picture of the plane here, this is from the back of the plane. This is not a super huge plane. It's a 757. So just keep that in mind, and we're going to get to that later. So there were also some radio transmissions after the flights were taken over for Flight 11 and Flight 93. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on them. The 9/11 Commission explanation for them is this. The hijackers probably did not know how to operate the cockpit radio communication system correctly, and thus inadvertently broadcast their message over the air traffic control channel instead of the cabin public address channel. JARA, and then skipping to the 93 section, that was about Flight 11. And then for Flight 93, JARA, like Ada earlier, may have inadvertently broadcast the message because he did not know how to operate the radio and the intercom. So reasons for skepticism. I'm not sure if I touch it on the next slide, but I'm just a little skeptical of the fact that both the two of the hijacker pilots would sort of make the same mistake. But let's first, this is the first thing I want to touch on is Rudy Deckers, who trained Mohammed Atta at Huffman Aviation in Florida in the year 2000, had this to say about when he heard the recording. I swear on my life, that's not Atta's voice. This is not Atta speaking. The guy that is on this tape is, in my opinion, a black guy from the Bahamas, speaking not with a monotone, but flowing like. Atta was dead man walking. Atta had a voice that was monotone. All right, so let's listen to it.
Is that American 11 trying to call?
Buddy, we have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We're turning to the airport.
15 Southwest of Bono going to Hampton, climbing there. And who's trying to call me here? American 11, are you trying to call?
Nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any move, you'll injure yourself and the airplane. Just stay quiet.
Okay. And then there was a third transmission. My personal take is that the first two do sound a little odd and maybe not quite like a Middle Eastern person speaking. The third one, maybe a little more towards Middle Eastern. This is just my personal impression. We are exploring the possibility of trying to verify, if we can verify one way or another, if this is Atta or if this is a Middle Eastern voice. But I'll play the third one for you now.
Nobody move, please. We're going back to the airport. Don't try to make any stupid moves.
Okay. As I mentioned before, to me, it seems improbable that hijackers on two planes would accidentally use the radio instead of the intercom. And before I explain, I'll play the recordings first. But well, let me explain first. The recordings the transmissions you'll hear from Flight 93, in particular, the second one at 9:39 a.m. Reasons to be doubtful of it. There was a pretty dangerous aviation situation going on in the plane at that time. And Olivier is going to talk more about that in his presentation. But the pilot, in order to get the plane out of that situation, would have to be pretty focused on flying the plane. The other thing is when you look at the phone calls, the circumstances on the plane were such that there was no passenger unrest at 9:39 a.m. And the hijackers, based on what the callers were saying, were in pretty regular contact with the passengers. So it just seems a little odd and out of place and abrupt for a hijacker to suddenly use the radio to communicate with, try to use the radio to communicate with the passengers. I'll just give you guys a listen to this, even though it's not that critical to the case.
The captain, please sit down. Keep remaining sitting. We have a bomb aboard. So it's
Okay, and the second transmission.
86, right? Hi, this is the captain. I would like to all remain seated. We have a bomb aboard and we are going to back to the airport and we have our demand. So please remain quiet. Okay, it's United 93 calling.
Okay. Again, I'm not sure why he would try to make that announcement to the cabin based on what the callers say is kind of going on in the cabin at that time. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So part two, the 9/11 Commission explanation for the success of the hijacking attempts. So the story goes that there were 4 teams of hijackers. There was one on each team who was trained as a pilot, and I've kind of highlighted those with a red square. According to the callers, this is what the 9/11 Commission report bases the story largely on. It's all that there is really to go on, is that the hijackers used knives. Box cutters were reported on one flight, on Flight 77. Mace or pepper spray was reported on a few of the flights, I believe, and the threat of a bomb. It's speculated by the 9/11 Commission that the hijacker pilot, specifically Atta and Jara, but possibly those Flight 11 and Flight 93, typically were not involved in taking over the plane, and they entered the cockpits after the pilots were incapacitated. So this means that in terms of the actual people that are controlling all the passengers and going to the cockpit and defeating the pilots physically, that you've kind of subtract one from that. So in the case of Flight 93, you got 3 guys who are allegedly both controlling all of the passengers on the plane and defeating the cockpits in the pilots in the cockpit. So how did the hijackers enter the cockpits? Despite 28 real-time calls from the 4 flights, many from flight attendants and first-class passengers, the 9/11 Commission report states, and this is specifically for Flight 11, but applies essentially to all 4 flights, we do not know exactly how the hijackers gained access to the cockpit. The 9/11 Commission speculated a few different methods. The first was jamming the door open. This is based on one sort of speculative comment from Betty Ong, one of the flight attendants on Flight 11, who purportedly called the ground. And it is actually not super difficult to break open a cockpit door. At least back in 2001, from my research, they were designed to not be that hard to open because people might need to get in or out in an emergency escape or what have you. But anyway, that was one speculated method. The other, forcing the flight attendant to unlock the door, kind of physically coercing her and walking her to the door and forcing her to open it with a key, or obtaining the key from the flight attendant, stabbing her and grabbing the key or something along those lines. The last would be that's in the report is maybe they lured the pilots out of the cockpit by stabbing the flight attendants, causing a commotion, and the pilots opened the door. The 9/11 Commission doesn't know. The explanation for the other flights, UA-175, similar tactics to Flight 11 is what the 9/11 Commission says, based on a few different factors. Flight 77, there's none, despite both callers from Flight 77, as we'll get into later, being situated in first class, at least before they were moved to the back of the plane. Both callers, a flight attendant and a passenger, Barbara Olson, were situated in first class. Flight 93, no explanation, despite 5 first-class passengers and 2 flight attendants making phone calls. Okay, and others, but especially those are significant. And one thing I want to say, I'm having trouble seeing what slide number I'm on, but can I move this? No. Okay. Well, I'll just go as fast as I can. I'm on 22. Okay. So how do hijackers remove the pilots? Despite 28 real-time calls, many from flight attendants and first-class passengers, and sounds of a loud, violent struggle on Flight 93, which most of the calls came from, there are only two calls out of all these calls mentioned anything, what happened to the pilots. In 9/11 Commission Staff Statement 4 states, there is scattered and conflicting evidence about what happened to the cockpit crew during the takeover. So again, the reports from those 2 callers, an unidentified male flight attendant on Flight 175, both pilots were killed. No description of how. And the 2 other callers who called from Flight 175 didn't mention the very notable fact that both the pilots were dead. Flight 93, a gentleman named Todd Beamer, who's famous for the let's roll statement. He described the pilots being pulled out of the cockpit, or allegedly he described it. The story's a little fuzzy there, which we'll talk about briefly later. He said pilots pulled out of the cockpit lying on the floor. No info about Flight 11 or Flight 77 pilots. The 9/11 Commission report states, so this is again getting to, well, how did they all succeed? Essentially, the 9/11 Commission claimed that they just weren't trained to handle suicide hijackings. So this is what the Commission said. The final security layer, security on board commercial aircraft, was not designed to counter suicide hijackings. The FAA approved common strategy, taught flight crews that the best way to deal with hijackers was to accommodate their demands, get the plane to land safely, and then let law enforcement or the military handle the situation. FAA training material provided no guidance for flight crews should violence occur. Okay. And this is further from the staff statement 4 that I referenced a little earlier. Just the point of the common strategy was to optimize actions by a flight crew to resolve hijackings peacefully through systematic delay and, if necessary, accommodation of the hijackers. Thus, on September 11, 2001, the common strategy, which they call the last line of defense, offered no defense against the tactics employed by the hijackers of these planes. So they describe the training of the pilots as the last line of defense, which is a little odd. The big question here is, wouldn't de-escalation training go out the window if hijackers were attempting to actually kill the pilots, or remove you from the controls of the aircraft? So in order to answer that question, I decided to look through the historical record for every hijacking attempt that I could find that we might call a suicide hijacking, or where a hijacker or hijackers are attempting to actually remove the pilots from the controls of the plane. And so that was really the key criterion here. Hijackers trying to remove the pilots. This can include incidents where the hijacker did not attempt to fly the plane after the pilots were incapacitated, but just let it crash. It can also include incidents where maybe the suicidal intent was not totally clear, but the hijacker or the assailant was trying to remove the pilots. What I did not include was maybe incidents where the hijacker's intention was suicide, but by getting the pilots to fly the plane into a building or somewhere. What we're really interested in here is, how do people behave, the pilots, the crew, the passengers, when a hijacker or an assailant is trying to remove a pilot from the controls. So out of the hundreds or even perhaps thousands of hijackings, I could only find 8 examples of this type of incident. So basically 99% of hijackings involve hijackers trying to control the planes and get the pilots to fly somewhere or do something. There aren't that many of these types of incidents. But how do people behave in these incidents? The interesting thing that I found was that they really divide into 3 categories that really track with, over time, how difficult is it to get a weapon onto a plane. So back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, these were incidents that involved guns. And in the 90s, we had 2 examples with other weapons. And then we had 3 examples all in the year 2000 where there was nobody was armed. None of the assailants in these situations were armed. I'm going to skip past this part of the presentation. It's about 16 slides where we kind of go through each of these kind of case studies. But I'm going to just go to sort of the takeaways from this, and we will put the PowerPoint up so that people can review the historical data in detail if they want. So get ready to just skip through a bunch of slides here. Okay. Okay. So the takeaways from the historical examples: in 2 out of 3 cases where guns were used, the hijacker managed to remove the pilots from the controls and keep them from gaining control. That's also a key, is not only removing them, but keeping them from getting control back. These are the only instances of a quote unquote successful suicide hijacking attempt. So the gun is what really made it possible. In contrast, in all cases involving other weapons or no weapons, when the hijacker attempted to remove the pilots from the controls, the pilots refused and a violent struggle ensued. In all cases, the pilots eventually regained control of the aircraft. Okay, so totally different outcome when different weapons or no weapons were used. Therefore, the idea that the pilots, this is just a general observation. The other thing I want to just say, which you would have really gotten a taste of if we had gone through the examples, is you will see that hijackings, especially a hijacking where people are trying to remove a pilot from the controls, are very chaotic events, very unpredictable, very scary. And, it's chaos. Okay, so therefore, the idea that the pilots wouldn't have physically resisted violent attempts to remove them, or would be unlikely to prevail in a physical struggle, simply on the basis that they were not trained to deal with such hijacking attempts, which is what the commission essentially argues, is contradicted by the historical record. So additional takeaways: what types of features do we see in these types of incidents? In 4 out of 5 cases involving non-gun weapons or no weapons, the plane went off course. In one case, the plane was literally seconds away from turning upside down and plummeting and crashing. The one case when the plane didn't go off course, which was Alaska Airlines Flight 259, is when the pilots were warned by the cabin crew that a hijacker or an assailant was coming to try to get into the cockpit. So they were more ready. In all non-gun cases on commercial flights, so we've excluded one that was not a commercial flight, it was a FedEx flight. But so in all non-gun cases, the later cases, The flight attendants and passengers quickly came to the cockpit to help. Okay. In 2 out of 4 examples, the pilots actually used the intercom system to ask the passengers for help. In 2 out of 5 non-gun cases, the pilots were able to alert air traffic control while the hijacking was in progress. Okay. I'm not going to do the side note there in the interest of time. Okay, so that's sort of what our takeaways from looking at the history of suicide hijacking attempts. Part 4, let's compare the 9/11 hijacking story with the historical record. So again, typical features of a suicide hijacking. Bear with me, I'm just going to read through this text right now. Failure. Okay, very common feature is that all of these attempts fail when we're not talking about with the use of a gun. While hijackers before 9/11 failed in every case where guns were not involved, the hijackers allegedly went 4 for 4 on 9/11. 2, deviations from flight path in 4 out of 5 historical examples. Only in one 9/11 case, UA-93, was there any deviation, and the small degree of deviation is suspect, as I've already spoken to. 3, communication with air traffic control. There was communication with air traffic control in 2 out of 5 historical examples. Only in one case, UA-93, now looking at 9/11, UA-93, was there any purported communication via radio. And no pilot on any flight squawked the universal hijack code. So one thing I did find is that in these examples where pilots are being attacked, maybe communication with the air traffic control squawking the hijack code isn't a given because they are actually in the midst of defending themselves. Nonetheless, it still did happen in some cases, and so we might expect it to happen in at least 1 or 2 cases on 9/11, maybe more. Typical features continued. So this is now going to what happens among the people on the plane. A sustained violent struggle between the hijackers and pilots. This happened in all 5 examples. There were 28 real-time calls. Now thinking about 9/11, there were 28 real-time calls and not one description of a struggle and only 2 vague mentions of what happened to the pilots. And we will get more to this later. 5, the pilots call for passengers and crew to help them. This was the case in 2 out of 5 historical examples. In terms of 9/11, not one mention of pilots asking passengers for help or otherwise communicating with the cabin. 6, cabin crew and passengers quickly come to the cockpit. And this is in all 4 historical examples where there were passengers on the plane, excluding the FedEx flight. Although there were reports of individuals being attacked in the cabin, which we will take a look at, there was not one mention of multiple passengers coming to help in the cockpit. And I think this is especially odd for UA-93, where we know that there was an at least minute-long struggle in the cockpit. Okay, would teams of 4 or 5 hijackers, so maybe you're thinking, okay, well, all these actually had only one assailant, one hijacker. That's true. That's the big caveat here. So the question is, would teams of 4 or 5 hijackers armed with knives or box cutters really produce the opposite outcomes across the board? And would they really produce almost none of the typical features of suicide hijackings on all 4 flights? So this is what the senior counsel of the 9/11 Commission, Dietrich Snell, had to say. He found this idea, essentially the proposition I just made, remarkable. This is from a report of the 9/11 Commission in December 1, 2003, when Snell met with the Team 1 and with Vice Chair Lee Hamilton. Dieter finds it remarkable that they gained cockpit entry and controlled passengers, even though none were physically imposing. The tallest was probably 5'8" and weight averaged 120 to 130 pounds. Pilots don't just abandon their cockpits. Okay, so looking at the circumstances on the flights on 9/11, what are some obstacles that would make gaining cockpit access for the hijackers more difficult? That would weigh on the side of it being more difficult for them. Pilots receiving advance warning. So if hijackers substantially herded the passengers or crew to the back of the plane before invading the cockpits, the cabin crew would have more time to notify the pilots. So we have to keep in mind, if you want to argue, hey, the reason why nobody described the hijackers entering the cockpits or described the struggle with the pilots is because they were all in the back of the plane. If there was that much time to get them to the back of the plane, it is more likely that a flight attendant would have communicated with the cockpit and said, hey, there's hijackers on this plane, close the door. but we don't see that. So now these are actually specific examples of pilots getting advance warning. At 9:24 a.m., 4 minutes before the alleged takeover on Flight 93, the pilots received a message from a United Airlines dispatcher saying, "Beware any cockpit intrusion. 2 aircraft in New York hit Trade Center buildings." So this was at 9:24. So this was after the 2 towers had been struck. And then the pilot responded at 9:26 a.m., 2 minutes later, saying, "Ed, confirm latest message, please, Jason." So it's a little ambiguous what he means by that, but he got the message and he responded. There were actually indications that they had received other messages or overheard conversations about missing planes or the crashes in New York earlier than that. If you actually listen to the radio frequencies that they were on, the hijacking or a missing American plane was mentioned on frequency they were on, as well as crashes in New York. So they must have been on alert already even before getting these messages. And there was apparently a message also sent by another dispatcher on behalf of the wife of one of the pilots, Leroy Homer Jr., shortly after the second crash in New York, saying, "Leroy, are you okay?" That dispatcher sent 3 messages to the cockpit and none were answered, which is actually very strange as well. But so there was ample warning received by the pilots on Flight 93, or there should have been. The UA-175 pilots also overheard the hijacker transmissions from Flight 11, the transmissions allegedly from Mohammed Atta. They overheard those. They were on the same frequency. They overheard air traffic control discussing 11 being hijacked, and they were actually asked to visually identify the altitude of Flight 11, which they did. So again, they should have been on alert, which means that they would take more precautions and defend themselves, be more ready to defend themselves. Okay, so other obstacles to gaining control of aircraft. 6 out of the 8 pilots, and at least 1 on each flight, served in the military. I'm not going to run through these in detail, but fighter pilot in Vietnam, Navy fighter pilot, Navy fighter pilot in Vietnam, U.S. Marine Corps aircraft commander, Naval Academy graduate, and Navy fighter pilot, U.S. Air Force Academy graduate and pilot. So all these people were highly trained, presumably in defending themselves, and were strong, and et cetera. And the pilot of Flight 77 is particularly notable for his training and sort of strength. His sister said he went through this training at the Navy, SEER, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape. He was very tough he had very tough psychological and physical preparation. Chick, his friend, Chick was really tough, and the terrorists had to perform some inhumane act to get him out of that cockpit. I guarantee you. Okay, also, what about the passengers? Because as we've seen, passengers tend to get involved in these types of situations. So I'm just going to look at 8 passengers on Flight 93 very briefly. We had Mark Bingham. He was 6'5". He was a former rugby star. He was seated in 4D in first class. He once fought off 2 muggers armed with a gun. Thomas Burnett, 200 pounds, 6'2". All these people are under the age of 40. Was a QB of his high school and college football teams. Briefly was in the Air Force Academy. Both of those guys were in first class. Todd Beamer, 32, 6 feet, 200 pounds, seated in 10D. He was in, I think, the first aisle of coach class. Played lots of sports, was the captain of his college basketball team. Bill Cashman, older guy. He was a paratrooper in the U.S. Army, studied martial arts, was an iron worker for 40 years. Jeremy Glick, 31, 6 feet tall, seated in 11A, so pretty close to the front, was a collegiate national judo champion and rugby team captain. A friend said, "I was a 6 foot tall, 255-pound football player, and he could bring me to my knees in 3 seconds." Linda Gronlund, 46, seated in first class, was a karate brown belt. Richard Guadagno, 38, was a federal law enforcement officer trained in hand-to-hand combat and how to respond to a hijacking. He could bench press 350 pounds, 2.5 times his own weight. Flight attendant Cece Lyles she was 33, previously a police officer for 6 years. She passed advanced officer survival, which included hand-to-hand combat and takedown moves. And she was actually known for her willingness to tackle fleeing criminals. In contrast, the alleged hijackers were slight in build and not armed with particularly dominating weapons. The 9/11 Commission report says the so-called muscle hijackers were not at all physically imposing. Most were between 5'5" and 5'7" in height. The 9/11 Commission report implies that the knives that they used were under 4 inches of length. Otherwise they probably would not have been able to get them onto the planes. So the question is, my question is, would the 8 aforementioned people in Flight 93 and the 30 others on Flight 93 simply stand by with basically one 5'7" inch hijacker who's carrying a small knife, holding them off while the pilots were engaged in a violent cockpit struggle, screaming for their lives, and with control of the aircraft hanging in the balance? The official story essentially claims that 4 teams of 4 or 3 muscle hijackers, all under 5'7", armed only with small knives or box cutters, were able to control dozens of passengers and cabin crew while gaining access to the cockpits and engaging in and decisively winning violent, deadly struggles with mostly military-trained pilots, some of whom were on extra alert. And all of this happened without any of the following things happening on a single flight: the plane going substantially off course, the pilots alerting air traffic control, at least in a clear way, and not just saying Mayday, Mayday over again. The pilots calling for the cabin crew and passengers to help. The cabin crew and passengers overcoming the 1 or 2 hijackers, controlling them, and coming to the aid of the pilots. None of those things happened on any of the 4 flights. So do the 28 real-time phone calls from the airplanes contain any information that would lead us to conclude that this remarkable story is true? And the answer is no, to the contrary. So part 5, the phone calls, the nail in the coffin of the 9/11 hijacking story. Okay, so there were more than 28 calls attempted and even connected, but I've focused on 28 calls. I've isolated 28 calls where there was actually a connection for a few seconds, or at least 10 seconds or so, and where information was actually conveyed. Because right now I'm just interested in what was the story coming from the planes on these through these phone calls. So just to give you a bird's eye view, on Flight 11, one was from one call was made from a flight attendant, Betty Ong, lasting 27 minutes. 2 were from flight attendant Madeline Sweeney, lasting 43 seconds and 13 minutes. All 3 calls were to American Airlines ground personnel. In the case of Madeline Sweeney, she actually spoke with people that she knew at Boston Airport, whereas Betty Ong spoke to strangers. UA 175, one unidentified flight attendant called you. So you had one unidentified flight attendant calling from 175, calling a United Airlines office. 2 passengers made 2 calls each to family. There were other calls made, but we're focusing on the ones where there's actual information about what the callers were describing. The calls range from 27 seconds to 3 minutes. Flight 77, we had 1 call from a flight attendant, Renee May, to her family, and 2 from Barbara Olson to husband Ted Olson, who was the U.S. Solicitor General. These calls range from 1.5 to 2.5 minutes. Flight 93, we had 2 flight attendants made 2 calls each. The first to the United Airlines office in San Francisco, and all 3 other calls were to family. 10 passengers made a total of 13 calls to family, and the calls ranged from 28 seconds to approximately 20 minutes. So the types of evidence, how do we know what was stated in these phone calls or anything about them? This is the type of data we have. Phone data provided by Claricom in the case of the American flights, and GTE in the case of the United flights. GTE produced data for United the day of 9/11. So, but on the day of 9/11, the days after, and after that, these phone companies provided this data to the FBI. And the official story today is that all the calls except for 2 came from airphones. 2 on Flight 93 came from cell phones. We're not going to investigate any of that in this presentation, but just for reference. FBI reports on interviews with recipients and other info that the FBI obtained, on the day of 9/11 or whatever, reports from people calling things in, et cetera. This is the main source of evidence about what was stated in the phone calls. 9/11 Commission reports on interviews, so memoranda for the record usually, on interviews with the recipients. So 3 years later, the 9/11 Commission re-interviews some of these people who were interviewed by the FBI. There was also a lot of reporting in news stories and books. So interviews with the people who received the wives, the husbands, partners, et cetera, and books written about this. And recordings. There are also recordings of a handful of calls or voice messages Most of the recordings are voice messages. There's one call, one actual call with the Betty Ong. But most of the evidence of the calls comes from reports, but that the FBI made, not from recordings. So category 1. So basically here, I'm listing out the issues that exist with the phone calls and how they actually undermine the official story of the hijackings. And when we have two separate categories here, one is omissions and contradictions. And so I'm just going to read these. Not one caller described how the hijackers entered the cockpit. We've already discussed that to some degree. Not one caller described how the hijackers overpowered the pilots, and only two callers mentioned what happened to the pilots. So these are essentially omission. 3, and I've starred in red the few that I think are the most important in terms of refuting the official story of the hijackings. And these generally have more to do with contradictions. Reports from several callers place the cockpit invasions later than the alleged takeover times, and reports from one flight attendant on Flight 93 indicate no cockpit invasion at all. Continuing in this category, we have callers provided contradictory reports of violence that are irreconcilable. Again, this is one that I think is this more stronger evidence against the official story. And 5, callers provided minimal description of the hijackers and contradictory reports on the number of them. The second category I call unrealistic hijacking situations and behavior. Several callers, and this one I star in red, several callers described unrealistic hijacking situations, and that's going to especially be the case on Flight 11 when we get to it. We also have inexplicable behavior by flight attendants. And lastly, a majority of the callers were reported as strikingly calm, which doesn't seem realistic, and we'll get to that at the end of the presentation. Okay, so I just want to go back to the minute-long, loud, violent struggle on Flight 93. My contention is that such a struggle would have been highly noticeable. I mean, maybe if they closed the door, I don't know, but I think that such a struggle is going to be highly noticeable. And what I want to point out here, and I'll try to make that case, is that the names that you see in orange, you're not going to be able to read them, but the names you see in orange are the passengers were seated at the beginning of the flight, or perhaps when the hijackings began. It's quite a coincidence that all of the passengers who made calls were sitting either in first class or in the first few rows of coach class. The one that that's in green is the passenger who ostensibly was the passenger who was stabbed on Flight 93. But all the passengers who were not ostensibly stabbed in first class all made phone calls. So what would it look like if you were sitting in first class and you saw the struggle take place? You would be able to see it. You'd be able to hear it, is my contention. Even in coach, this is the first photo on the left is a photo in first class looking back at coach. And then the second photo is from the back of coach looking forward. Again, I think that if there's a struggle in the cockpit like that, my contention, my suspicion is that actually pretty much everybody on the plane is going to hear it or find out about it very quickly. This is where the passengers who made the phone calls allegedly were when they made the calls. So they've been pushed to the back of the plane. This starts at 23, the back of the plane I have highlighted at the bottom there, 23 all the way to the back. And this will become relevant in a little bit when we compare the accounts that the different callers are giving. Okay, so I'm just going to read the underlined text here. If people want more detail, they can come back to the PowerPoint and look at it. But so the first call from UA 93 was from Thomas Burnett, took place at 9:30 and 32 seconds. So about a minute and a half after the cockpit struggle. The call lasted 28 seconds. And Thomas Burnett said to his wife, Thomas Burnett was talking quietly and told his wife that the flight he was on had been hijacked. The hijackers claimed to have a bomb. He also told his wife that a passenger had been knifed. Okay, so he was sitting in first class when the hijacking started. Who knows exactly when he got pushed to the back, but he calls his wife, and despite the minute-long struggle that took place, or more, that took place in the cockpit, the first thing that he tells his wife is a passenger was knifed. Okay, The transcript that she wrote a transcript on the website for the foundation that she started in her husband's name. And so, these calls were very short, the calls that she had with her husband. She said, the plane's hijacked. He said, yes, they just knifed a guy. She said, a passenger? He said, yes. The hijackers have already knifed a guy. So his whole focus is on the guy that was knifed. He doesn't say anything about the pilots, doesn't say anything about the struggle in the cockpit. I'm not going to get into this because I've already conveyed what needs to be conveyed here. Okay, the second call where any real information was imparted was a few minutes later from a flight attendant named Sandra Bradshaw. This call was actually about 6 minutes long. The female flight attendant said that 2 male hijackers who had knives were on board, one of which was in the first class section of the plane, and the other was possibly in the cockpit. That's from what the FBI wrote about their interview with the United Airlines employee who received the call. We also have a handwritten statement as part of that. And he said in the statement, 1 man attacked a flight attendant, but no passengers or crew were hurt. So we have one report from one guy of a passenger being stabbed, and then we have a report from a flight attendant of a flight attendant being attacked, but no passengers or crew, and crew generally would mean flight attendants and pilots, are hurt. So the same man, Richard Bellamy, who spoke with Sandra Bradshaw, and I'm just saying, by the way, I'm just saying that sort of hypothetically, as that's what's been reported. I'm not assuming as fact that Sandra Bradshaw actually spoke with Richard Bellamy, but for the purposes of this, we're just assuming that. This is what he then testified to the 9/11 Commission a couple of years later. And his story has changed quite a bit, and it's changed, in my view, in a way to fit with the official story. But there's also some tidbits in there that are really interesting, even besides that. So I'm going to read the underlined parts. They had attacked a flight and killed a flight attendant. Okay, so they killed the flight attendant's actually been killed now. Okay, the reason why that might have slipped in his story, possibly, is because the 9/11 Commission at some point, or the investigators at some point, say that there was a murder of a flight attendant in the cockpit. Okay, so maybe that's why that slipped in. She said they did not harm any passengers. So, okay, flight attendant was harmed and killed, but not the passengers. She said that there were 2 more hijackers behind the curtain in first class. So now his story has become that there are 4 hijackers. But then the 9/11 Commission MFR, Memorandum for the Record, also states that Bellamy's notes indicated that he reported a total of 3 male hijackers. So he had 2 in his first call, his first interview with the FBI. His notes say 3. He's now telling the 9/11 Commission 4. She did not describe the hijackers. It is also noted in the MFR, there was no indication there was a struggle. So, okay, the story on the killing of a flight attendant that's become part of the story, but still there's no indication of a struggle, did nobody tell her, or did she not hear or see the struggle with the pilots and the hijackers? Okay, the alleged murder of a flight attendant in the cockpit. The cockpit voice recorder indicate that a woman, most likely a flight attendant, was being held captive in the cockpit. She struggled with one of the hijackers who killed or otherwise silenced her. Okay, I'm just gonna, what I said there was, okay, if you actually look at the transcript of the cockpit voice recorder, it says that there was really a struggle and conversation between a hijacker and the victim from 9:32 to 9:37, culminating in the apparent murder of the victim. Would no one hear this? Would Sandra Bradshaw not report to United Airlines or to her husband at 9:50 that a flight attendant, her colleague, was in the cockpit or missing? Okay, so we going back to our list of omissions and types of reasons why the story doesn't add up. We've kind of gotten a strong taste of the first 2, a little bit of 3 and 4, which I think are the most important. That the timing of the invasion doesn't line up, or that they reported contradictory violence. I'm just going to focus a little bit now on the 5th one, that the callers provided minimal description of the hijackers and contradictory reports on the number of them. And the reason why I'm doing that now is because the 3rd call from Flight 93 is really the best segue into that. This is from Mark Bingham to his mother at 9:37. The call lasted about 3 minutes. A lot is made of the fact that Mark Bingham said, "Mom, this is Mark Bingham." That is relevant. I think actually a more significant thing about this call is what happened after that. So let me read through this. Bingham then said, There are three guys who have taken over the plane. Maybe I want to read. Sorry. There are three guys who have taken over a plane. They say they have a bomb. I'm calling you from the airphone. Okay. Alice Hoagland then asked, "Who are they, Mark?" Bingham was distracted and did not answer. Alice Hoagland was not sure if her son had heard the question. There was an interruption for approximately 5 seconds. Bingham then stated to his mother, "You've got to believe me. It's true." Alice Hoagland responded, "I do believe you, Mark. Who are they?" There was another approximate 5-second pause, similar to the first, wherein Alice Hoagland heard activity and voices in the background. People were murmuring. There were no screams. Alice Hoagland got the impression that her son was distracted because someone was speaking to him. Then the phone went dead. So essentially, her son was unable or unwilling to tell her anything about the hijackers, even though he was sitting in first class, I believe in 2A or either second row or the fourth row, which is, by the way, where all the hijackers came from. He was surrounded by the hijackers. Okay, 16 of the 19 callers. So just to zoom out now, that was the most acute example, but 16 of the 19 callers didn't describe the hijackers. Todd Beamer described them as individuals. He referred to them as the guys. Thomas Burnett just said they, and it was noted in the FBI report that he never provided any descriptive data regarding the hijackers. Sandra Bradshaw, in her first call to United Airlines office, said 2 men with knives are on board. She did not describe the hijackers in that first call. We'll find out that she did actually give some description of the hijackers to her husband when she called him a few minutes later. Marion Britton did not mention any identifying information about the hijackers. This is text from the FBI reports. Joseph DeLuca, just it's way that it's transcribed in the report is he referred to them as terrorists. Edward Felt, who called from the bathroom on his cell phone, allegedly said, "Hijacking in progress." Lauren Grancolis, "We're having a little problem on the plane." Linda Gronland, who called her sister, said, "I'm on U-993 and it's been hijacked by terrorists." And that's what it says in the transcript of her voice message. Cece Lyle said to her, and this was in a voice message, so we have a recording of it, "I don't know what to say. There's 3 guys. They've hijacked the plane." Well, we can just listen to that briefly. I've just cut out the snippet.
"And I'm so sorry, babe. I don't know what to say. There's 3 guys. They've hijacked the plane. I'm trying to be calm. We're turned around."
Okay. Honor Wainio, who called her mother or her stepmother, did not provide any other pertinent information regarding the hijackers. That's from her FBI report. Betty Ong said, also used the word "the guys." "I think the guys are up there." Let's hear her.
Well, if they were shrews, they would keep the door closed, and
I'm sorry?
would they not mean the cockpit?
I think the guys are up there. They might have found their way up there or something. Nobody can call the cockpit. We can't even get inside.
Okay. Peter Hansen gave no additional information as to the identity, nationality, physical description, accents. This is on Flight 175 of the hijackers. Brian Sweeney told his mother, "I don't know who they are." Unidentified flight attendant just gave a very sort of generic, he informed me that the flight was in the process of being hijacked. He also stated that one flight attendant had been stabbed and both pilots had been killed. Didn't describe how. Renee May, this is from the report of the interview with her parents. Renee did not provide any description of the hijackers. Barbara Olson did not say anything to describe the hijackers, but did refer to them as they. So we have 3 callers out of the 19 who did. Jeremy Glick said to his wife that the plane had been hijacked by 3 Iranian-looking males with dark skin and bandanas, the ethnic type as opposed to hippie type, on their heads. Sandra Bradshaw, in her second call, the flight attendant from Flight 93, said 3 men with dark skin. The plane had been hijacked by 3 men with dark skin, and Sandra stated they almost looked like they almost looked Islamic. All 3 of the hijackers put red headbands on their heads as they were hijacking the plane. And then Madeline Sweeney described them as 3 Middle Eastern males. You might have noticed that I keep referring to three hijackers, and there were teams of 4 and 5 according to the 9/11 Commission. So All 5 callers who gave the number of hijackers stated that there were 3. That is Mark Bingham, Jeremy Glick, Todd Beamer, Cece Lyles, and Sandra Bradshaw, although there's a little fuzziness with her, 2, 3, 4 in Bellamy's interview with the 9/11 Commission. But essentially, he wrote down that she said 3. The 9/11 Commission explanation for this discrepancy. Several passengers on United 93 described 3 hijackers on the plane, not 4. We believe it is more likely that Jara, the crucial pilot-trained member of their team, remained seated and inconspicuous until after the cockpit was seized. And once inside, he would not have been visible to the passengers. So I find that pretty implausible, that just would have been 3 guys doing all the business, and Jara kind of got herded along with the crowd, and then when the time was right, he just escaped from the crowd and shot up to the cockpit and did his thing. And that not a single passenger, and keep in mind that people are going to be talking on the plane. So when these people call, they're kind of calling, they're not just necessarily reporting their own perceptions. There should be like a collective understanding of what's going on in the flight that is sort of being shared by everybody to some extent. And yet not any of these callers mentioned a 4th hijacker. Both Ong and Sweeney mentioned no more than 3 hijackers on board. I won't go into detail there, but and that's on Flight 11. On Flight 77, Renee May told her mother that the plane she was on had been hijacked by 6 hijackers. Okay, maybe in the chaos of the hijacking, there was 5 and you might count 6. That's a little more plausible. But in any case, it is off from the official story. Okay, so we're going to go back now to the reports from several callers placing the cockpit invasions later than the alleged takeover times, and reports from one flight attendant indicating no cockpit invasion at all, and also callers providing contradictory reports of violence that are irreconcilable. So Thomas Burnett's, this is the 5th call from United. So Burnett's calling his wife again relatively early, just 7 minutes, 7 to 8 minutes after the alleged takeover. And he says, now, this is from the FBI report. It says he asked his wife if she had heard about any other planes. Burnett mentioned during this conversation that the hijackers were talking about flying the plane into the ground. Now, there's a little discrepancy, and I don't actually think it's that relevant of a discrepancy between what was reported about the 2nd call and the 3rd call in the FBI report versus Dina Burnett's transcripts on the Foundation website. But according to Burnett, in the 2nd call, according to Dina Burnett, it's in the 2nd call that Tom now said, and this is a new information from Tom, that they're in the cockpit. The guy knifed is dead. So those are 2 really big pieces of information there. The hijackers are in the cockpit. Kind of implies when you, I skipped something earlier, but it kind of implies that they weren't in the cockpit before. Also, the guy knifed is dead. Tom said, yes, I tried to help him, but I couldn't get a pulse. It's odd that Tom was the one helping him. If it's true, that's great. But there were 3 EMTs on the plane. It happens. And we don't have any report of any EMT trying to help this stabbed man who then died. So the FBI, according to the FBI 302 of Dina Burnett's interview, it was in the 3rd call at 9:44 that Burnett told her that advised his wife that in this call that the passenger who had been knifed had died. He told her they, and I didn't add those quotation marks. That's from the FBI report. They were in the cockpit. So whether it's 9:37 or 9:44, at either of those times, Burnett reports to his wife that the guy who was stabbed has died, and the hijackers are, maybe in parentheses, now in the cockpit. Later, she would wonder, and this is the slide that I skipped before, but it's in a book called Among the Heroes by Jer Longman, who profiled all these families and what happened on Flight 93. He said, later, she would wonder whether Tom called before the hijackers had taken control of the cockpit. It seems that way based on how he reported that they were now, or that they were in the cockpit. Jeremy Glick called his parents, his wife's parents' home where he knew his wife was at 9:37, spoke to her for about 20 minutes. This call actually lasted, according to the records from GTE, lasted 2 hours and 6 minutes, because Glick's father-in-law never hung up the phone. And it's unclear whether the phone that he was calling from remained intact and the whole system he was calling from remained intact, but we're not getting into that. But I just want to note that this call actually lasted 2 hours and 6 minutes, but the portion that they spoke for was about 20 minutes. Jeremy first told Elizabeth that he loved her and then said that Flight 93 had been hijacked by 3 Iranian-looking males. Jeremy advised Elizabeth that the hijackers had herded the passengers into the rear of the plane. One of the hijackers then told the passengers to call their loved ones. The 3 hijackers then entered the cockpit of the plane. Now, I'm not going to get in, because of time, I'm not going to get into the counter possibility that maybe these guys, there was already somebody there, and these guys were just the ones watching them, and then they went into the cockpit. Sure, you can make that argument. I'm not going to delve deeply into it. I'm just going to look at all the evidence that's there. Okay, so the call from Jeremy Glick, despite speaking with his wife for approximately 20 minutes, Glick did not mention any acts of violence against any pilots, flight attendants, or passengers. When speaking to his wife, Glick was sitting just 2 rows behind Thomas Burnett during Burnett's second and third calls, in which he reported that the man who had been stabbed had died. And Jeremy Glick didn't tell his wife anything about this. And they were just sitting 2 rows apart. Todd Beamer's call to GTE at 9:43. So a few minutes. This is also a call that lasted until around 9:58 or 10 o'clock. It was also a call that actually went for another hour and 5 minutes, because they didn't hang up on the GTE side, or they didn't hang up on, well, yeah, it went longer than you would expect it to if the plane had crashed. But we're not getting into that right now. We're just focusing on what was reported. Jefferson received a phone call at approximately 8:45 a.m. Central Time. Beamer called to state that the airplane was about to be hijacked. He stated that 3 individuals were preparing to take control of the flight. So this is at about 9:45, because he actually spoke to another customer service person for a minute or so before Lisa Jefferson took over the call. So at 9:45, according to Beamer, the hijackers are getting ready to hijack the plane. Jefferson estimated that she spoke to Beamer for 7 minutes, so that would put it at 8:52, before the 2 hijackers armed with knives entered the cockpit, securing the door behind them. Subsequent accounts, from what Todd could see, okay, this are things that were not in her FBI 302, but that she reported first in a handwritten statement of what happened, and then she actually said to Lisa Beamer, and there was a transcript taken of her call with Lisa Beamer, Todd Beamer's widow, when she called her 4 days after 9/11. But so the story, there's little things in the story started added and changed a little bit, but maybe these things did actually happen. I'm not going to argue that they didn't. From what Todd could see, 2 people were hurt. Not sure if they were dead or alive. The hijackers went to the cockpit and locked the door. Okay, so Jefferson did not mention Beamer saying anyone was hurt or lying on the floor. Only the guys went into the cockpit, took the pilot and co-pilot out, and locked the door. So we have one person actually saying something that happened to the pilots. Mr. Beamer then told, this is the 9/11 Commission memoranda for the record. Mr. Beamer then told Mrs. Jefferson that 2 people were lying on the floor and bleeding. Ms. Jefferson heard the flight attendant say to Mr. Beamer that the 2 men on the ground were the pilot and the co-pilot. Ms. Jefferson believes that everything that Mr. Beamer had told her up to the part about the hijackers closing the curtain to first class had already happened, and that Mr. Beamer was bringing her up to date. So the 9/11 Commission realized that there was an issue with the story that was in her FBI 302, and so in the course of the interview, she said to them, "Oh, he must have just been bringing me up to date on what had happened." But does that really sound credible? These are the things that were in the 302. Beamer called to say that the plane was about to be hijacked, and that the 3 individuals were preparing to take control of the flight. Now, I could maybe accept that those were misunderstandings in the writing of the report, but it's the third one that makes me think, because I'll read it. Jefferson estimated that she spoke to Beamer for 7 minutes before the 2 hijackers armed with knives entered the cockpit. So that is actually like a time-specific thing where she said, this is when this happened. This is when it was reported. According to Jefferson's book, one other reference, there are two people lying on the floor in first class. I think they're hurt. I can't tell if they're dead or alive. The flight attendant next to me says it's the pilot and co-pilot. So my questions are, did Beamer see the pilots get pulled out of the cockpit or not? If he did, why doesn't he know whether or not these are the pilots on the floor? If he didn't see them get pulled out, wouldn't their uniforms still make it kind of obvious if you could actually see them from row 33 and they're lying on the floor in first class? That might be kind of difficult, I think. But if he sees them, can't he tell based on how they're dressed if they're pilots or not? Or if he saw them being pulled out of the cockpit? And why do no other callers report any of this? That's the big question. Marion Britton, she made a call 9:49 to her boyfriend. She said, Britton said the hijackers had cut two passengers' throats. Okay, that's a new report that has not been made. Further, Sandra did not say if the hijackers went to the cockpit of the plane or okay, this is a new one. Sandra Bradshaw's call to her husband at 9:50. Further, Sandra did not say if the hijackers went into the cockpit of the plane or not. This was in the first interview with him on 9/11. This is in this interview with her husband on September 12th. Sandra Bradshaw informed her husband that three hijackers were on the plane. All were sitting at the front of the plane and possessed knives. During her call, Sandra assumed the airplane crew was still in the cockpit and in control. However, the three hijackers were also at the front of the plane. How could Sandra Bradshaw assume the pilots were in control, given the struggle at 9:28, which I imagine that everybody on the plane would be aware of 22 minutes later, and probably have heard or seen, and with Burnett, Glick, and Beamer all reporting the hijackers in the cockpit. And if you look at the little diagram down there, she was sitting directly across, she was sitting one row behind Beamer when she made her call. So he's describing something that's completely different. They're talking at the same time. They're describing something completely different. And then across from her is Britton, who's describing two passengers' throats being slit, also at the same time. So irreconcilable reports of violence and death. We have the cockpit voice recorder, a woman assumed to be a flight attendant murdered in the cockpit. We have Thomas Burnett saying one passenger knifed and dead. We have Sandra Bradshaw saying one flight attendant attacked, but no crew or passenger hurt. Then she says, when she talks to her husband, no violence or missing flight attendant is reported to her husband. We have Todd Beamer, pilots removed from the cockpit and lying on the floor in first class. And Marion Britton, we have two passengers' throats slit. Okay, Beamer, Bradshaw, and Britton were all across from each other or one row apart. These are all the passengers on the callers from Flight 93 who didn't describe any violence. Jeremy Glick in his 20-minute call and sitting across from Burnett did not describe any violence. And you can go on down the list there. And many of these people were sitting close to the people that were reporting these acts of violence and death. Flight 77 callers also appeared to have reported a late cockpit invasion. So at the cockpit invasion, the alleged takeover time, the time of the alleged takeover on Flight 77 was between 8:51 and 8:54. At 9:12, Renee May called her parents. So this is 15 minutes later. Renee May told her father that the hijackers were removing the crew and passengers to the rear of the airplane and attempting to gain access to the cockpit. This is another interview about her phone call with her parents. Renee May didn't know anything about the state of the pilots at the time. And then this is an AT&T operator who spoke with Barbara Olson before she got through to her husband. The hijackers, armed with guns and knives, were ordering the passengers to move to the back of the plane. The passenger wanted to know how to let the pilots know what was happening. It did not appear as if they were aware of the situation. And this is 20 minutes after these pilots were allegedly removed from the controls of the plane. Category 2, unrealistic hijacking situations and behavior. And we're getting close there. We're in the last 100 meters here, if not closer. Several callers described unrealistic hijacking situations, inexplicable behavior by flight attendants, majority of the callers. All right, yeah, I will be wrapping up soon. So the situation on Flight 11 described by Ong and Sweeney. Two flight attendants this is the overall picture on Flight 11. 2 flight attendants were stabbed. 1 business class passenger was fatally stabbed in the throat, and mace had been released in first class. All first class and business class passengers moved to the back of coach class, moved to the back to coach class, and yet coach class passengers are not aware there's a hijacking. They only believe there's a medical emergency. Ong also stated that she did not believe that the coach passengers were aware of the hijacking. How is it that all of these people who just witnessed 3 stabbings and a man dying and mace has been sprayed in their face, as they move back to the coach class, would not start to tell people in coach what happened? How would the people in coach not hear any of that? And what this is, in my view, covering up for is the fact that none of the other people on the plane made calls. That's the only way to sort of cover up for that sort of thing that just doesn't make sense. Up front, that was in the back. Up front, no one in first class and business class, and they can't get into the cockpit. We can't get up to the cockpit. The door won't open. So apparently, if they can get all the way up to the door, there are no hijackers or stopping them from reaching the cockpit. And there's no mention of the cockpit, any pilots on the floor outside the cockpit. So are we to believe that all 5 hijackers and the 2 pilots are all stuffed in the cockpit? This was from an FBI report of an interview with somebody at American Airlines. Sweeney described to Michael Woodward the atmosphere in the aircraft as calm while the hijacking was carried out. So I don't know if there was ever a calm hijacking in the history of aviation until on 9/11. UA-93 passengers were free or even encouraged to make phone calls. I'm not going to get into this one a lot, but Jeremy Glick reported to his wife that one of the hijackers told the passengers to make calls to their loved ones. That is not plausible in a real hijacking situation. Ms. Glick later changed her story a little bit and said that Ms. Glick indicated that Mr. Glick did not tell her the hijackers were urged. He only indicated that hijackers did not seem to care that the passengers were on their phone. Still not very plausible in a hijacking situation, in my view. Again, Todd Beamer stated the hijacker seemed to be aware of the fact he was on the phone, but they did not seem to care. And then also, Mrs. Jefferson, this is the 9/11 Commission MFR, Mrs. Jefferson then told him that the authorities had been notified and not to endanger himself by talking on the phone. Mr. Beamer replied that he was free to talk. As I already mentioned before, why didn't many more passengers on all 4 flights make phone calls? If they all had earphones in front of them and all this is going on, why do we just have 2 flight attendants at the back of Flight 11 making calls? Allegedly, it's because they didn't know what was going on, even though there was mace in the plane and all the passengers from first class and business class came to the back. 3 people had been stabbed and a guy was dying. Okay, I'm going to skip past this one, and if people want to go look at it, but there was a lot of inexplicable behavior from the flight attendants, ways the flight attendants just wouldn't behave in this type of situation. There's also just things that they reported that made absolutely no sense. Ong and Sweeney both initially stated that they were on Flight 12 in their own separate calls. That's a whole can of worms to get into, but something that doesn't make sense. Lastly, the calmness of the callers. So I think something like 11 of the 19, and maybe there's more that I'm not aware of, but at least 11 of the 19 callers were described as very calm. Beamer's voice was so devoid of any stress. In fact, he sounded so tranquil, it made me begin to doubt the authenticity and urgency of the call. Mark Bingham, throughout the entire call, her sound sounded calm. Sandra Bradshaw was shockingly calm, according to Richard Bellamy. Thomas Burnett, it was as if he was at Thoratex sitting at his desk and we were having a regular conversation. Jeremy was extremely calm, but also sounded very concerned and confused. Lauren Grancolis, in her voice message, her voice was very calm. Madeline Sweeney, Woodward said that during the entire conversation he had with Sweeney, her voice remained calm and even, maybe because the hijacking on her plane went very calmly. Brian Sweeney, his conversation was subdued. Unidentified flight attendant, Polly Castro was reluctant to believe him, the unidentified flight attendant, because the caller was calm and there was no background noise. Renee May, Nancy May, her mom, further stated that her daughter sounded as though she was very calm during the conversation. And lastly, Barbara Olson, she sounded, this is her husband speaking on Larry King Live, she sounded very, very calm. in retrospect, enormously, remarkably, incredibly calm. So the conclusion, in my view, and I hope I've made the case to you successfully, are that the phone calls were false evidence reporting fake events that were produced and disseminated during the commission of the 9/11 crime. Since the phone calls are false, there is no evidentiary basis for the already implausible story of the violent hijackings. The dissemination of false evidence meant to support the implausible hijacking story allows us to conclude that that story is actually false. If there's actually people that are disseminating false evidence to try to prop up that story or tell that story, I think we conclude that that story is false. So that's my presentation. I would just like to say thank you to some researchers who paved the way and did excellent research from which I drew: Elizabeth Woodworth, David Ray Griffin, Elias Davidson, a researcher who goes by the alias Loop the Loop, as well as current colleagues who helped with this research: Alan Merrill, Olivier, Caron-Mason, and Piers Robinson. And lastly, I would just like to say the question on people's minds might be, well, how are these calls made? I want to just be clear that if it was these actual people who made these calls, that is not to suggest at all that they were in any way sort of willful accomplices in this crime. They were almost certainly, without doubt, victims of this crime. And so we would owe it to them to uncover that. If it was not them, we owe it to them, and it is imperative that we figure out who did make these calls and how. And zooming out, I think it's, it goes without saying, but I think we need to remind ourselves in the world that the best way to honor these victims and the 2,977 who died on 9/11 and the thousands who died afterwards from the toxic chemicals they inhaled and the millions who have been killed in the post 9/11 wars is to find the truth about what happened that day. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation.
Thank you, Ted. That was a fascinating forensic analysis. It reminds me, the devil is in the detail with so many aspects of 9/11. And I think, going through in this level of detail, especially the content of the calls and then fitting into the bigger picture of what we know about the flights, is really going to pay dividends in terms of understanding properly what happened in the skies of 9/11. It is a lot of detail, and I recommend to viewers, take the time to go back through the presentation, think about the calls, think about some of the aspects of what Ted is saying in the presentation. And, it takes a bit of time, but you do start to get a real sense of the implausibility of what we have been told about what happened on that day. So thanks very much, Ted. That was fantastic. We're now going to move, and we're pretty much on schedule, which is good. We're now going to move to Olivier Caron-Mason, who is a qualified pilot and flight instructor. He's been doing some excellent work with us at IC911, as Dan Hanley pointed out. And he's going to present to us now his assessment of essentially the lack of plausibility of the official story about relatively inexperienced, newly trained pilots being able to fly the flight profiles that we see on 9/11. So we have a shift now looking into much more closely at these technical questions of how these hijackers are supposed to have flown these planes and how unlikely that was. So over to you, Olivier.
Thank you, Piers. Thank you, and thank you, Ted. So in this section, in this segment, we're going to focus really on conducting what I call a piloting feasibility analysis by examining the flight profiles with a view to contrasting, in effect, the level of difficulty that would have been encountered. On the one hand, let's say for a Boeing 767 or 757 type-rated airline pilot, and on the other, the kind of challenges that an inexperienced pilot would have faced. And we'll be examining just two of the flights in this segment, looking specifically at flights United 175 and 93. The primary research focus was really the same, is to critically examine whether the flight profiles of these two flights could have been controlled by the alleged hijackers. We're going to analyze the feasibility of the official narrative based on a detailed forensic examination of the flight profiles. And as Piers said, this presentation is part of a broader investigation into the technical and operational challenges. And I sourced the data from the NTSB reports, which were very enlightening, and we're going to get, into some detail, as well as some other reliable documentation. So we're going to look at 175 first and 93, because they're very contrasted. And what we're going to do is focus on the key factors like descent rates, altitude management, and precision in executing really very complex maneuvers, as we're going to see. And we're going to explore whether the official narrative actually aligns with the level of skills required and that these inexperienced pilots, we were led to believe, possessed. So we're going to start with United 175. Here's a flight profile overview. And I'm sorry if the graph and the image looks a bit cluttered with many lines, but this presentation, this PowerPoint is, of course, available to anyone who would like it. And this is sourced from the NTSB report by Jim Ritter, who was a Chief Vehicle Performance Division officer at the NTSB. And on the left, you have the pressure altitude radar mode C returns. Those are from the onboard transponder that during the whole flight will relay to the radar the altitude at which it's operating. So let's just quickly look at this overview. Many of you maybe know at 8:14, flight United 175 takes off from Boston Logan International Airport. At 8:42 was the last communication with air traffic control. And 5 minutes after that last communication, you have an assumed takeover. And as Dan alluded to and Ted underscored, Captain Victor Saracini was a former naval aviator, and his first officer, a former Marine Corps pilot, and they were neutralized, and we don't know how they were neutralized. And I want you to imagine that if one of them or both of them were neutralized or coerced into giving up their seat, this is highly unlikely. As Dan said in the introduction to this symposium, it really is not in the ethos of pilots to hand over a cockpit or flight controls. Even if they were coerced, should one of the hijackers have threatened to kill one of the flight attendants or a passenger, they would have immediately made a judgment call in that should we need to sacrifice one to save the others, that would have been the choice that would have been made, I'm pretty sure of it. I want you to also imagine if one of the pilots is neutralized in his seat, just one of them, you have to take one in order to be able to gain access to the controls, the yoke, and all the instrument panel, and so on. Imagine taking away a dead weight if you're slight and you're only 5'7" and you only weigh, 60, 70 kilos. I'll let you translate that into American pounds, but it would be very, very difficult. So anyway, it's alleged that Marwan al-Shahi then assumed control of the aircraft. And you can see this on the graph on the left. But I want to draw your attention to the first two vertical lines between point E and just after F, the blue line and the red line. There is at 8:51 a sudden climb to 34,000 feet in 2.5 minutes. And we'll get back to that in a second. We don't know what provoked this. It could have been an accidental manipulation of the autopilot altitude setting, but this is not reported as to how it occurred. And then between F and G at 8:54 a.m. The aircraft, the Boeing 767, enters into an uneven descent of approximately 8,500 feet at a descent rate of 2,400. Now, that's not extreme. You have to note that descent in normal commercial operations is between 750, 1,000, sometimes 1,250 feet per minute. But it is already showing a pronounced descent profile. So a few minutes after it initiated this descent, there was a sudden jolt, a vertical jolt, the explanation for which is not provided either. But we'll come back to that later on in this segment. And then, as from point G onwards, it enters a severe descent. At this stage, we're looking at some 4,000 feet per minute. And if you look at the black line in the report, where I have put to the right side of which a deep and pronounced red arrow, you have a nose dive attitude all the way down to the ground to, effectively, you can't read it on here, but let's, for ease of purpose, let's just say 903. NIST, in fact, determined that the Boeing 767 hit the tower at 9:02 and 59 seconds, but we'll take 9:03:50. And you can see that it's an absolute vertical, increasingly accelerating descent rate. But we'll come back to that in some detail in a minute. So here we've got this continuously accelerating descent at 8:58. At 9:02:59 is the impact with the south tower. United 175 hits the tower as determined by NIST. Now let's look at this in a little more detail. This slide here, which I'm about to show, sets the stage for a deeper examination of the maneuvers that followed, and we were fortunate. Here in this overview, you have on the left-hand side again that image with the altitude returns from the transponder. This is to give you an idea of the path that the ground track that United 175 took during its trajectory, with the critical times, and what really happened during this journey, if you want to call it that. United 175 underwent a series of really complex maneuvers after the alleged hijacking. You have a 180-degree turn and descent. The aircraft began a steep descent, which required precise handling of either the autopilot or the manual control via the yoke, or a combination of both. There's no indication and no report as to what systems were used for this. And what is very hard to explain is the management of the descent, which reached a peak of 6,500 feet per minute in the last few seconds, but mostly from G onwards, it accelerated to 6,000 feet per minute. Just managing that, bearing in mind that the autopilot and auto throttle combination couldn't really handle changes in this attitude and profile very effectively, or would respond sufficiently fast in order to tweak your descent profile. This would require really expert handling of pitch, thrust, speed, and for a Boeing 767 type-rated commercial airline pilot, this maneuver would already have proven to be a very, very serious challenge, if not, extremely difficult. And whereas for an inexperienced pilot, it seems highly implausible that any form of control and maneuvers were implemented, and due to the extreme control complexities. And there's another kind of mystery in this, and we're going to address this in the next file. We were lucky to have also another report by a certain Daniel Bauer, who's a senior aerospace engineer at the NTSB, the details of which are shown here. And these come from the airport surface surveillance radar from Newark, EWI's Newark Liberty International Airport, which show four portions. You see these four horizontal bands. The first one showing altitude, the second one the ground speed, the Mach number we won't go into here, and the magnetic heading. So we know what the aircraft is performing. Now, if I just draw your attention to the first one, it goes from 9 a.m. on the dot to 9:02:30 plus 10 seconds, 9:02, 9 hours, 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Now, you might see this red line in the altitude profile as being a very gentle gliding slow glide path towards a descent. But in fact, you must remember these are increments of 5 seconds. And in fact, the descent is very, very steep. At 9:02:40, which is at the very right side of the graph, so now we're looking at the last 10 seconds of recorded data. The aircraft is still in an extreme descent rate of approximately 6,000 feet per minute. It loses 1,000 feet in 10 seconds, multiplied by 6. We're around 6,000 feet per minute. Just before I go into further detail for your information, the aircraft also accelerated in the last few seconds. It started not 10 seconds in the last 10 seconds of recorded data, but about 15 or 20 seconds before the ground speed started increasing significantly from 490 to 520 knots. And it takes some time to build up the necessary thrust to reach that speed, and I'll get to that in a minute. Whilst they were trying to manage their way out of a steep descent and adjusting they were also, adjusting their heading, banking to the left, 35 degrees to 28 degrees. The engines, the power plants would have been in flight idle mode, because if you had any power in such a steep descent, you would have reached and gone beyond the speed of sound, which would have made the plane either fall apart because of structural damage, or you would have stalled the aircraft because of the buffeting on the wings, and there was no more lift. And there's something which is not alluded to, and I haven't seen in any of the documentation, is that nobody takes into account the fact that this Boeing 767 on United 175 was fitted with Pratt & Whitney 4000 turbines. Now, these turbines, in order to provide any degree of thrust and all the way to full thrust, need between 5 to, at best 5, and all the way to maybe 8 seconds to deliver thrust by the time the throttle levers are pushed forwards and the engine actually delivers the setting that you've requested. And this is very critical, because these 5 to 7 seconds need, or 5 to 8 seconds needed to apply full thrust, suddenly throw a spanner in the works, so to speak, when you see in a few minutes the video footage that I'm going to show you. And did the pilot in command have the wherewithal to apprehend this, or did he have the presence of mind to think, oh yes, I'm going to have, in the midst of this stress, we must remember we're here looking at graphs and writing on paper. But imagine, place yourself in a cockpit with God knows what is happening in the rear, or very close to the cockpit door. We're in a high stress situation, and from the evidence and that we've been provided with, these were not military trained Iranian or Iraqi or whatever pilots. These were a strange motley crew who were supposedly capable of performing incredible feats. And we'll keep in mind this 5 seconds, spool up time, because there's a great mystery in what the reports say and what the video footage that I'm about to show you points to. That is, when did they level off? Now, you remember the big, strong, thick red arrow that goes all the way down to the ground at 9:03. That was Jim Ritter's report. Look at this one here. You'll see that the altitude, the very first bar, the horizontal bar, the altitude profile, there's absolutely no sign of a leveling off. At 9:02:40, that's 19 seconds before impact. You have an aircraft screaming into the ground at 6,000 feet per minute. You have a huge amount of kinetic energy, which you have to convert in order to level off. And then you will need also to apply power in order to give you controllability an acceleration to justify the increase in ground speed in the last 10 minutes and 10 seconds, excuse me, and the last 19 seconds. Okay, you'll probably have a degree of kinetic energy from the steep descent that will be converted into acceleration, but that won't be enough for the final 19 seconds. So we have a mystery as to when did they level off? How do I level off? At which point do I start thinking about leveling off? And before I take you to the next slide, another case in point, at 902.40, so still descending at 6,000 feet per minute, you would have had during all this time, from point G and maybe even further up, from point F onwards, you would have had a cabin pressurization system that would have struggled to maintain a stable and constant pressure altitude in the cabin. What does this mean? It means that under severe conditions, and the pressurization systems are not equipped to handle many, many minutes of extreme descent profiles, this would have caused a lot of physiological distress to the occupants of the airplane, ears popping, nosebleeds, hyperventilation, and so on. There's a whole number. Second, you would have had extreme psychological distress because all you know as an occupant of the 767 is this plane is nosediving to a crash. What else can you be thinking at this time? Now, this may come as a surprise, but the alleged pilot is not exonerated from experiencing physical symptoms. So would he have the presence of mind and especially the experience to think, well, I'm going to have to get some supplemental oxygen, which is available, of course, in the cockpit, for an extreme maneuver in which I'm about to embark, because I don't want to be overcome by hypoxia. So as he's thinking about this, very unlikely. Would he be also thinking about the spool-up time necessary to give the aircraft sufficient power and thrust for control to maneuver the aircraft into the Boeing 767 into the South Tower? So I'll leave you with that on this slide. So here, I just wanted to give you a kind of visual perspective and reference. I'm sorry if on your screen this may look a little small or a little cluttered, but we're looking at this flight profile. The United 175 is 10 miles away from the South Tower. That is 1 minute away from the South Tower. At that moment, you can see on the bottom of the image, UL 175 is approximately just above High Rock Park in Staten Island on a bearing of 38 degrees, I believe, and it's going to turn a little later. Now, another thing which I haven't come across as I was looking through the evidence and the documentation is it was a severely beautiful day, beautiful sunshine on September 11th. And you would have had quite some sun glare from coming at you, some 75, 76 degrees relative to the cockpit. And this would have thrown quite some reflection on the instruments, provided, of course, Marwan Al-Shahi was looking at the instruments, the principal flight displays, and so on, to make sure that the aircraft was coordinated, was behaving in a manner consistent with maneuvers that it was about to execute. As you can see with each passing comment that I make, this seems more and more implausible, if not improbable, if not impossible. So here we are, 10 miles away from the South Tower. He's descending through 7,000 feet at high speed. We're still at 6,000, maybe 6,500 feet per minute. He's in a steep nose down attitude in an accelerating descent, and that's consistent with both NTSB reports. Again, these two NTSB reports are not consistent with the video footage, which I'm about to show you. So let's put ourselves in the position and in place of the alleged hijacker who's sitting in one of the two seats. And of course, the coordination is very different whether you're occupying the left seat, the captain's seat, or if you're the first officer's seat in the right hand, because you may be a little more, it may be a bit more cumbersome or gauche to kind of control the airplane with your left hand versus your right hand. That we don't know. We have no evidence and no data to support on which side he was sitting, if at all. Now, so we have this plane again in a steep nose down attitude. And he's flying. He cannot be flying with an autopilot, and I'll get to that in a second. So we're assuming he's flying VFR, visual flight rules, looking for visual references. So you're 10 miles out, you're in a steep descent, and you've got to find the World Trade Center. What am I looking at? And they look, tiny little slivers on the horizon. You've got sun glare, and in that attitude, the World Trade Center would have appeared high on the windshield as you're trying to locate it. It wouldn't be simply in front of you as you're in a level, straight and level flying attitude. So that adds further complexity because this need for visual references is compounded by the sun glare. Autopilot heading and selection and auto throttle use are unreliable and totally impractical at this stage. So we can but assume that he was flying manually. So you can imagine the level of difficulty that this inexperienced pilot would have encountered because manual control would be essential for this final adjustment. All right. Now, here we are going to look at a video which comes from a certain Achim Sport, that's his handle on YouTube. This video is still available. And this person did a great job of overlaying with precision with some kind of computer software the flight trajectory that that United 175 had. Not in the last few seconds. There's a CNN clip which shows already, and I'm sure a lot of you would have seen it, and I must apologize because these images and this video footage is quite distressing. On all of you who are watching today, will have seen the CNN footage which shows 4 seconds of straight and level flight to the South Tower. So the plane, 4 seconds before hitting the South Tower, had already leveled off into parallel to ground, effectively, flight attitude. But we have extra footage, and I want to say almost extraordinary footage, which comes from the MSNBC choppers, which had been dispatched up in the air, who were covering the events immediately after American 11 had crashed into the North Tower. And here we have, in effect, and in fact, 12 seconds of recorded flight attitude. And here we are. I'm going to play this video, and I'm sorry, but it does require being seen on a big screen, and we won't see very distinctly the 12 seconds. So here we have. This is the CNN exclusive footage, which shows the plane on a straight and parallel to ground situation. This lasts about 4 seconds. This is the MSNBC footage again, which here lasts 12 seconds, and you saw the 12 red dots in this simulation. And here we are again. And I'm sorry, it is very, very difficult to pinpoint where the aircraft is coming from, but you can just about see it there. And the airplane is, the 767 is already very on the straight and narrow, straight parallel to ground flight attitude. And here we have it coming from the right of the screen into the tower, and on a very slow glide path. It must be about 100 to 200 feet per minute descent, 12 seconds before impact. And I'll just let this play on. And here we are again. So there's a timestamp recording the 12 seconds to impact. And again, I'm very happy to share this footage, or you can go and get it on the YouTube site, Achim Spock, where you'll be able to, blow the image up on your screen and see it with much more precision. In no way, 12 seconds before impact, was the plane in a steep descent as reported in the 2 NTSB reports. So the question arises, why are these 2 NTSB reports not consistent with what our eyes are showing us? We have to believe our eyes. So I think this is the last segment of the. So here we are, 12 seconds prior to impact, the improbable final maneuvers, I call them. So we've got this extreme descent. I said so a moment ago at 9:02:40, 19 seconds before impact. We have an impossible transition to achieve level flight by 9:02:47. That is to say, 12 seconds before the 12 seconds of the recorded data. And you would have had to apply full thrust at some point in the proceedings. And in the best case scenario, it would have been, 5 seconds after the descent on the NTSB profiles, which doesn't give you enough time. It gives you just a handful, just a couple of seconds to reduce the descent from 6,000 feet. And I must say, for those who are not, haven't been in extreme situations, and I have, because I used to train primarily military Air Force and Navy pilots for the clients of the company I used to work for, and we used to do extreme profile altitudes and extreme descents and in all sorts of situations. And when you're descending at a high rate of descent, it takes careful planning and lots and lots, many hours of simulator training in order to achieve this. And here, it's a feat that's quasi impossible to achieve by an inexperienced pilot, let alone, and I'm speaking under Dan's control, but for a 767 captain and well-trained with thousands of hours behind him, it would have been very difficult. The coordination that would be required to manage pitch, thrust, roll, would demand exceptional skills. And the timeline points to a scenario that seems physically unachievable. So, synchronizing all this requires exceptional training. And in light of the limited or no simulated training on large commercial jets by the alleged hijackers, and no known training on the 757, 767 cockpits, they're the same, the mind boggles, as the English would say. So that is yes, as I said earlier on, the highly complex set of maneuvers would be challenging for a seasoned captain or first officer, highly trained, many hours of training, because when you're in a simulator working for an airline, most of the training that you do in a simulator are emergency situations, critical situations, and they spend many hours doing this. So all this is kind of these complex set of maneuvers is highly implausible to be achieved by Marwan al-Shehi, and it casts significant doubt on the official narrative. And just to give you an idea of what this might represent, here's a typical twin piston aircraft cockpit layout on a, let's say, Piper Aztec. I took as an example here, which is a typical aircraft that's used for training, amongst others, but they're very similar. Once you've completed your private pilot's license and you want to go onto a multi-engine aircraft, you will go on aircraft of that era looking like this. And then I want you to imagine the kind of almost quantum leap that it would represent to find yourself in a Boeing 767-200 cabin cockpit with a very complex layout for let's call him a novice pilot, with very sophisticated systems, navigation aids, all sorts of levers and throttles that you won't have seen during your training, unless you spent maybe 50 or 100 hours in a commercial liner simulator. And there is mention, I came across a report where they actually entered into a Boeing 727 legacy simulator, which is very much different, although the basic layout is the same. These kind of systems are quite different to the ones they would have encountered. So there's a significant leap in complexity from your typical twin engine piston aircraft you would have encountered during training, and that of a Boeing 767-200. So that's what I want to leave you, leave in your mind, is this very odd disparity between the two NTSB reports by Drimrit and Daniel Bauer that simply don't show a leveling off period, let alone the other, incoherences which we're led to believe allowed the alleged hijackers to perform these astonishing feats. So now we're going to move on to United 93. This is we'll get to the strangeness of this trajectory and story. We have the flight path study here, also by Jim Ritter, of February 19th, 2002, which shows what the airplane did during its. Here we go. Sorry, I had a little trouble with the clicks here. 842 takes off from Newark Liberty International. At 9:28, there's a 600-foot altitude deviation, which is the assumed takeover time. Now, Ted alluded to this in his presentation. This little jolt, loss of altitude at point C, can be attributed to a number of things. It could be some wind shear, some wake turbulence that the aircraft encountered, which explain why it dropped a few hundred feet. It would have been, of course, on autopilot at this stage, so the autopilot correction would have kicked in immediately, but it's certainly not indicative of a serious trouble in the cockpit. And as I was saying earlier on, it's simply not in the ethos of captains and first officers to hand over a plane within, between 30 seconds and a minute. And this is not indicative of such an event. The pilot in control is Ziad Jira. And then we have something odd between the points C and D. We've got the claimed commencement of the cockpit voice recorder. Now, it's strange because they say in the 9/11 Commission report and in other publications that only 30 minutes of flight recording is available, whereas by the year 2000, the FAA had implemented regulation which required a 2-hour buffer to make 2 hours of flight cockpit voice recordings available. And here we say we have only 30 minutes. Which conveniently doesn't account for the previous 30 minutes or minutes before that. So that's another kind of oddity. For an inexplicable reason, you have at 9:34 at point D the beginning of an ascent, and not an insignificant ascent, from 35,000 feet to 41,000 feet in 5 minutes. And to add to the complexity of the fact that it's climbing for an unknown reason, you have an almost 180-degree turn, so a full about phase, in fact 170 degrees or thereabouts, left turn as you are climbing. I want you to keep in mind or visualize that the plane is climbing and you're entering into a left turn. That is going to be critical in a moment. And as you can see here, I have said that the aircraft was approaching its service ceiling. I'll get into that in a second. And approaching or entering, or maybe entering, what is known in aeronautical terms as the coffin's corner. And I will get to that in the next slide in more detail, because this is a critical and very mysterious portion of this flight profile. And so remember, you've got an ascent. In 5 minutes, it climbs 6,000 feet. Not a steep ascent, but it's climbing and nearing its service ceiling. For a Boeing 757-200 has a service ceiling, or that era has a service ceiling of 42,000 feet, and it's climbing to 41,000 feet. What is a service ceiling? The service ceiling of an aircraft is the maximum altitude at which it can still operate a level flight. And it also marks the point at which it can no longer sustain a 100 foot per minute climb. So it's reaching really the apogee of its performance characteristics. And one has to remember that at 42,000 feet, the air is very thin. In order to get much airflow over the airfoils, over the wings, you would need as much thrust as possible. So it's highly likely that as it was climbing, because we were lucky to have Flight 93, the flight data recorder also, and we have and I'll come to that in a second, I'll just refer to it just quickly, we have the autopilot and auto throttle settings for the flight profile, so we know exactly what the inputs were and what was being inputted on which switch. So for an unexplained, the auto throttle was set at a certain indicated airspeed, and for an inexplicable reason, was it tweaking, mismanagement of the autopilot altitude selector, the airplane decided to climb. Now, in order to climb and to maintain your set airspeed, the auto throttle will have provided probably maximum thrust, and certainly maximum thrust by the time it reached 41,000 feet. And between 41,000 feet and 42,000 feet, when you're reaching the aircraft service ceiling, the flight controls and everything becomes very mushy, very hard to control, and very difficult. And you are entering, as I said, what is known, or approaching or entering the coffin's corner. We'll get back to that in some detail in the next slide. I just want to quickly kind of finish off this flight profile for 93. Somehow, and you'll understand why I say somehow now, 939, United 93 enters a quite steep descent at 3,700 feet per minute. Why irrelevant at this stage, but we'll get back to the query behind this descent. You then have at point F, 7 minutes later, an abrupt 2,000 feet per minute vertical jolt. Now, again, imagine you're in an aircraft that has for 5, 6 long 7 minutes descended in a very steep attitude. Again, on board the aircraft, the cabin pressurization system would be struggling to maintain passenger comfort. And again, alleged hijackers were not exonerated from experiencing these physical symptoms. Again, they've had the presence of mind to think, I'm going to need supplemental oxygen and so on, let alone the physiological symptoms of the psychological distress to contend with. And the aircraft has amassed a huge amount of kinetic energy in its descent. And here we are led to believe, if we are to give any credence to what this graph is showing us, that within the space of a minute, the aircraft descends near 4,000 feet per minute descent. And suddenly, jolts up 2,000 feet. And that is a huge and very difficult change to experience, let alone, the 757 is a very robust aircraft, but the G-forces and, the disorientation that would have resulted, at the moment the plane climbed, would have been really significant. So keep that in mind. It's very odd, and then it once it gets out of this jolt, we don't know the reason for this. Maybe they want you to believe that it's the beginning of the struggle inside the cockpit, and that the passengers, as reported, are starting to take over or thinking of taking over. Unknown at this stage. It's pure speculation on my part. Then it continues between F and G during those next 7 minutes on a descent to over the next more than from 9:46 to 9:59 to point G. You have 13 minutes. It continues on its descent to reach 5,000 feet. And then the rest is, we're led to believe that the struggle takes place between G and H, where the hijacker is neutralized and the plane crashes 1 minute later, inverted at point I. So that's neither here nor there for me at this stage. Following this drastic nose-down attitude, as I said, it impacts the ground inverted. Now, I want to take you to an extraordinary feat and virtually impossible for not a non-highly trained simulator, trained airline transport pilot, to the coffin's corner. Now, you can see I've put on here the flight level 420 at 42,000 feet, which is the service ceiling of the 757-200. This red triangle after 40,000 feet, excuse me, is the beginning of what is known as the coffin's corner. We're going to get into detail on what it's about. Now, we know this from the United 93 Autopilot study, which I referred to earlier on, from the digital flight recorder data, which provided us with this information. And we can state that this is what the aircraft's attitude and maneuvers were, and what the inputs were into the system. So as you remember that I asked you to bear in mind that the 757 was in a climbing turn. And when you're climbing and turning at a very high, at any altitude, you have a disparity between one of the wing, the downward wing is creating less thrust than the turning wing. So less lift, I beg your pardon. So you're going to need to manage your thrust control. So here he is completing a climbing turn at 41,000 feet with airspeed decreasing between 200 knots. That is absolutely critical, because you're very close to approaching a stall speed at that in that configuration, in that flight attitude. The air is very thin. Your airspeed is bleeding dramatically. So, what is going on in here, in the alleged hijackers' mind at this time is very perplexing. What initiated this climb? We can speculate that it was a mismanaged input that led to the climb. As I said earlier on, the auto throttle was set to maintain a specific airspeed, and the climb resulted in entering the coffin's corner. Now, as Dan, would have told you, commercial airline pilots are highly trained, one, to recognize what the coffin corner is and when they might be approaching it. If by some set of circumstances they actually had entered it, they spend many hours practicing how to negotiate your way, because the recovery out of the coffin's corner is very, very tricky. There are very narrow margins between stalling and applying excess thrust effectively brings your max speed, you're closer to the speed of sound, which destroys the flow of air, or on the wings, reducing the lift dramatically. So it makes controlling this, negotiating your way out of the coffin's corner very difficult, and it requires extremely precise handling to avoid a stall or a dive. And as I said here, many hours of training are required. 1, to recognize, 2, to navigate when you're in it, and 3, to initiate a recovery. Again, we find ourselves in a very distressing situation for the occupants of Flight 93, psychological and physiological and emotional, from this steep dive, which would be exacerbated by the vertical jolt which happened. So let me briefly take you through, and I'll wrap up in a couple of minutes, so I'm more or less on time, with really unusual aspects of this flight, and that's why I chose it. United 175 gives us a very clear indication of this typical set of hijackings, if they were to be typical, and implausible. But 93 has a distinct flight profile. The altitude and navigation profiles deviate significantly from others, and I'll show you that on the next slide. Something very weird also, all the flight, American 11, American 77, United 175, the assumed takeover points took place between 15 and 30 minutes after the plane took off from their respective airports. And here you have a very delayed takeover. Here, 46 minutes after the takeoff from New York, and with every passing minute, you find yourself in more and more complex situational awareness position as to, when I take over, how do I know where I am? Where do I turn? Do they know how to gauge all the instruments and the flight director, the primary flight displays, in order to know where I'm at, how high, where I want to go, what I need to do to get there. So there are serious challenges there. The voice recordings I alluded to earlier on, I won't spend much time on there. Now, the most mind-boggling, puzzling aspect of this flight profile is, why descend to 5,000 feet? You're 46. You've been you took you 46 minutes to take over. You are either going to fly by a combination of autopilot or manual control. Be that as it may, whether it be the one or the other, if you are looking to identify your target, the last thing you want to do is to descend to 5,000 feet, because you have no visual references. So how do you know what you're looking for at 5,000 feet? Not only that, you're exposing yourself to further danger. You may encounter, there are collision risks. You may encounter some commercial flights on your downward trajectory. At 5,000 feet, you may encounter much general aviation traffic that would completely, neutralize your objective. And again, why descend to 5,000 feet? Because you're so far away from the Pentagon, the Capitol Hill, or whatever other speculative target you're trying to reach. You certainly wouldn't see it. You wouldn't know where to be going. You may have a general idea of a cardinal point, a heading. Okay, I have to go east. That's not enough. Continuing on the oddities, Ted spent much time on this, but I just wanted to underscore again, there was no indication of physical or psychological distress during the descent profile, during the descent portions of United 93. Again, highlighting the contradictions between the different narratives. And again, as Ted spent much time and clearly demonstrated, I just included this one. We're talking 10 minutes. They've been through a steep dive. They've encountered, physiological symptoms, and the plane is, one can only imagine, crashing, as it keeps descending without any change. There's been a jolt which would have imposed, serious stress and physical and otherwise to both plane and occupants. And you have Sandra Bradshaw calmly saying, I think hijackers are in the front, and assuming that the pilot is still in control. So what is it to be? I've nearly finished, Piers. Here we go. Just a couple of slides. Now, I want you to look at this because this is very, very troubling. I've spoken in this presentation, in this segment, about two flights, both United 175 and United 93. Look again. Focus on the points between F and G, and down to the ground. This is 175's flight profile, and this is 93's flight profile. How very strange. You have, after the assumed takeover point, both aircrafts climbing. What are the odds that both would demonstrate exactly the same kind of flight profiles? And they both initiate a steep descent. And again, what are the odds that during their descent, they both encounter a jolt, a vertical jolt in a descent which, for some strange reason, had no reason for being interrupted, other than somebody wanting us to believe that there must be some intervention, or there must have been someone trying to do something about this. So it's all very odd. There's this striking similarity between the flight profiles post takeover, uncanny. Again, unlikely coincidence that the near identical behavior raises, important question about whether these maneuvers were, legitimately inputted by the hijackers, or were they pre-programmed, or at worst, are we talking, and Dan very eloquently described in quite some forensic detail the fact that we may be dealing here, very probably, that's my conclusion, with automated and or external influence, let alone my demonstration of how it would be quasi-impossible, if not totally impossible, for United 175 to have happened in the way that we're shown by the NTU reports, let alone by the alleged hijacker. I'm suggesting here that there's the involvement of an advanced automated system, potentially with human oversight or intervention. It could be pre-programmed into the aircraft by software. It could be overlooked, and maybe with some intervention, automated or human on ground, controlling the aircraft to its absolutely tragic end. So here we are. If we are to recap, let's just quickly look at the key findings and the unanswered questions, and I'm finished after that. Piers, we've looked at the complexity of the maneuvers on both flights, the implausibility that they were executed by inexperienced pilots in view of their limited, training on complex commercial jets, which casts significant doubts on the official narrative. The impossible. Feel free to ask for my PowerPoint presentation to work out again the final, the disparity between the last 12 seconds of recorded data and the time constraints to exit the steep dive to make aligning the United 175 on time to be consistent with the video footage. And United 93, the irrational flight profiles to the alleged target. So I leave you with this. How could they perform under high-stress conditions, such extremely complex maneuvers? Why do we have such divergence between both NTSB reports and the video footage? How, for United 175, could they effectively control the 767 with so little situational awareness 10 miles out? Remember, they flew 10 miles in 1 minute whilst trying to handle, control, maneuver, apprehend the power settings, work out the proper heading they would need, remembering also that there was a slight 16-knot wind, a quarterly wind. And for 93, or why, what, or who caused the descent to 5,000 feet? There's no more to be said on that. It's absolutely mind-boggling. So here we go. Were there any external factors or interventions that could explain the behavior of the aircraft in those critical moments? And I'll leave you with these final thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Olivier, for that very detailed analysis. Just a couple of things before we move on. Certainly the the speeds as well that the aircraft was being flown at and that, that's one of the big questions, I think, for research going on is how these planes could be handled at 400 to 500 knots and so on in those final minutes. Then, of course, I know your analysis is moving on to 77, but the Pentagon aircraft, of course, that's an extraordinarily complex maneuver. It's a near 360-degree descending turn to then fly level with the ground. So I think, as with Ted's presentation, you get into the detail of this, of the official story, you start to see that the very clear problems that there are with that. So thank you very much for that, Olivier. We will now move to Aidan Monaghan, who is going to present to us on, really, in a way, where Olivier left off, was the question of how this could have been performed, these maneuvers, talking in detail about the question of GPS-guided autopilot control. Aidan, as I said at the start, he's in many years has been a researcher in the 9/11 research community. He's published in the Journal of 9/11 Studies, and he's going to share his expertise with us now on the question of the guided autopilot control theory of what happened to these aircraft. Aidan.
Piers, how do we sound today?
Very good. You sound excellent.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm glad that this information is finally getting some of the attention I think it's deserved. And with that said, let's just cut right to the chase. Around 05, 06, when I finally realized that the Trade Center towers were probably destroyed as a result of sabotage, I then began to seriously wonder if also the flights themselves were somehow controlled in ways that were not reported to the public. And I set off on a journey to find out if such technology or other capabilities existed. And to my surprise and relief, I was actually able to assemble, I think, a substantial body of evidence pointing in that direction. And with that said, we'll proceed to our first slide. It's a Boeing illustration which depicts what were referred to by the industry at the time, and perhaps to this day, as highways in the sky, as a result of augmented GPS service that was activated, curiously enough, in May of 2000, just before 9/11, about 16 months, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And what this augmented service did was provide a solution for the decommissioning of legacy nav aids like VOR, DME, acronyms for the industry, distance measuring equipment, very high frequency omni-range receivers, and others. And if we can, I'll test my slide control equipment here today. Bear with me, I apologize. Okay. Moving right along, in reference to the GPS improved act standards I was referring to, it's referred to by the industry as RNP, as in required navigation performance. It's a distance measure numeric.
Okay. Do we want to get Ted to call him? Has he just completely dropped out?
Okay, sorry for the interruption. Looking at slide number 2 here, we see a 208 foot wide World Trade Center tower, 157 foot wide wingspan of a 767, and a number of 243 feet, which is a numeric measure for the newly developed RNP, or Required Navigation Performance, industry standard for accuracy for en route and approach navigation. It's a measure of nautical miles, and the lowest standard I became aware of during research for accuracy of this system was RMP 0.02, which is 0.02% of 6,000 plus feet, of which a nautical mile is comprised, which leaves us with, essentially, long story short, a 243 foot wide corridor providing a 95% reliability for accuracy. And what you see in the illustration, long story short, is a nice fit of both the tower and the aircraft within these GPS supported vertical or virtual highways in the sky, as the industry referred to them at the time, and perhaps to this day still do. And with that out of the way, we shall proceed to our next slide. This again is just a visual depiction of what was described earlier, referring to nautical mile measures of RNP accuracy. And again, if it was missed previously when I was cut off, these systems were developed with the purpose of decommissioning other legacy nav aids like ILS, DME, VOR. Long explanations for each. The reader or the viewers are certainly welcome to investigate further within one of the 3 papers I've published on the subject at the Journal of 9/11 Studies. Moving right along, what we see here is a GPS planning software output graph that relied on what are known as GPS almanac files, which essentially, long story short, contain all of the GPS satellite data, orbital data for a given date. These were at the time, and probably still are today, hosted at the U.S. Coast Guard website. And with those files, I ran them through a software known as Trimble Planning Software, which essentially allows for a user to look as far as 2 weeks into the future accurately in order to anticipate GPS service for a given location at a given time. And drawing on the GPS almanac files for 9 and the coordinates of New York City, we see, I found that during the 9/11 attacks for the coordinates of the World Trade Center, the GPS service for the day at that location, at or near maximum, coincident or not, which may speak to foreknowledge by some party. And I found that rather remarkable. The same is also the case for the Pentagon crash scene. At or near maximum GPS service quality, which often rises and falls on the number of available visible satellites to a user segment on the ground. So again, another coincidence or not, slide number 2 of the Pentagon crash scene at the time of events there, maximum GPS service or thereabouts for the entire day period at those moments. Proceeding, what we have here, I hope, in the event it plays for us, is a video of a very telling event and events pertaining to Flight 175 as it approached. Okay, here we go. Building 2. We see it descending at a rate of about 10,000 feet per minute at the end. We see that prior to going behind smoke cover, it's flying a 10-degree descent, straight line, wings level. And once it reappears at about 1.6 miles distant, we find it settled into a 20-degree bank, very stable, unchanging except at the very end, where the plane from 20 degrees banks an additional 18 for a 38-degree bank at the end at impact. What we find using trigonometry, however, is that this final 18-degree twist was not essential for achieving impact. So long story short, what we see in this video is a plane that is essentially on target, 1.6 miles distant, at least, possibly longer. It may have settled into the 20-degree bank sooner while still behind the smoke cover. And what we find using trigonometry also, this additional 18-degree bank only generates 19 feet closer to the center of the building. Again, long story short, without that 19 feet, it doesn't matter. The plane still hits the building from 1.6 miles distant, at least. Additionally, this that we are viewing now requires the simultaneous coordination of two factors: a correct bank angle, as well as a correct bank initiation start time. While traveling at about 800 feet per second, one can simply visualize geometrically that what we see on screen, had it occurred 1 second sooner or later than observed, the plane necessarily misses the point of impact that we all saw on television that day for this aircraft, which is a strong indicator of something other than reckless, inexperienced human pilot control of the plane, in my humble opinion. I'm sure once viewers ponder this long enough, they will come to the same conclusion. That out of the way, we'll move on to our next slide. Some of the trigonometry I referred to earlier required the use of what are known as wind triangles, vector triangles, the high school trigonometry. Again, this information, as well as other, is contained in another one of 3 total papers at the Journal of 9/11 Studies. And we'll move along to our next slide here. This is a general illustration of the concept described earlier between the differences of 2 aircraft starting turns at identical locations while relying upon different bank angles, either 20 degrees, 25 degrees, 15 degrees. There are differences in turn radiuses that result in turns of different circumferences. Long story short, again, we can now move on to our next slide. Mentioned earlier, I spoke of the simultaneous coordination of 2 factors for what we saw with Flight 175. We see the initiation of a 20-degree bank angle simultaneously and precisely so with a correct turn start time. What you see in this illustration are 3 different start times and 3 different outcomes. And this is necessarily the case for 175. Had it even 1 second earlier or later than observed, began its 20-degree bank turn toward the tower. Again, at 800 feet per second, one can do the simple math. 1 second sooner or later results in a difference of 800 feet plus or minus. Again, this speaks to probably something other than inexperienced human pilot control as alleged by the official account. Next slide. One curious anomaly I came across during research. Apparently it was the case that the alleged hijackers purchased their tickets about 2.5 to 3 weeks before the attacks. Not only were they allegedly remarkable pilots, they were also possibly, if we're to believe the official story, remarkable weathermen, because what you see on September 10 is very overcast, rainy, stormy weather all the way through midnight and late and early into the morning of September 11. And had the attacks unfolded just the 24 hours before they did, they would have found the accused hijackers, World Trade Center towers completely enveloped in cloud cover, halfway up, under visual flight rules or performance that they were alleged to have undertaken. This would have been an impossibility, success that is, under these weather conditions. Again, halfway up the tower, the upper half is completely enveloped in cloud cover. Apparently, if we're to believe the official story, the accused hijackers were not taking weather into account. Next slide. Also, during some freedom of information research I engaged in over the years with a number of different agencies, one in particular of note is one of the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, wondering what the case may have been for these aircraft during the year prior to the attacks. I submitted a request for that info and discovered that 3 of the 4 planes on 9/11, used on 9/11, involved in 9/11, have no flight history for the entire year period previous to the attacks. And with Flight 77, we find that there was no information at all. And there was no explanation offered by the agency. Again, continuation of this FOIA request. And one can view these online at the journal and the links to these. Moreover, other anomalies pertaining to at least one flight data recorder that was recovered, the one for the Pentagon flight, Flight 77. Doing some research, I discovered that there were 2 flight data recorders recovered and 2 cockpit voice recorders recovered. And in none of them were there inventory control serial numbers provided within these reports, which is standard. In the 20 years previous to this, I found only one other instance for which an inventory control serial number was not attached to a flight data recorder and voice recorder device, which speaks to evidence integrity. Furthermore, the data output file for the Pentagon flight, American 77, contains, curiously, a data download timestamp that predates the recovery of the actual device itself by 4 hours, which is an impossibility. And the agency refused to address that within a request for correction of this anomaly, which the public is entitled to submit in the event they feel a need to do so. Moving along. One of my colleagues, Kevin Ryan, once upon a time discovered, doing research, that within both towers there were major sections that had been renovated with fireproofing in each tower. And coincidentally or not, each aircraft seemed to impact the very lowest portions of these recently upgraded fireproofing sections in each tower. And again, coincidentally or not, this is the case and may or may not speak to things underway that were officially not reported, and may in fact speak further to the accuracy of the augmented GPS service under autopilot control that I spoke of earlier. And now if our viewers with me as I scroll to another item to conduct discussion here. And as I said earlier, implemented WASPing wide area augmentation system, the augmented GPS service. This was the case in May of 2000. The very first aircraft by model that were prepared for avionics packages that were upgraded to utilize this service were in fact the Boeing 757 and 767 aircraft, which rely upon both, in fact, common avionics packages. The accuracy provided by these highways in the sky are about 3 meters up and down, left and right. For 5 years or so prior to 9/11, intensive research and development was during this period that relied heavily on Boeing 757 and 76 planes, coincidentally or not, leased by the federal government, from services such as UPS and FedEx, among others, as well as United Airlines. This newly augmented GPS service, additionally and remarkably, supports descending and ascending turns by aircraft. And coincidentally or not, this is what we see. This is the case for what we see with Flight 77 and its 270-degree descending turn above the Pentagon prior to impact, as well as Flight 175, as we saw earlier, as well as American 11 into Trade Center Tower 1. Coincidentally or not, this was the case, and this research was conducted by Stanford University, among others. Again, as I mentioned, Flight 175 was on target, apparently based on measurements performed that were the result of provided ground speeds, air speeds, and observable bank angles. Bear with me as I scroll through to continue our talk. Of interest regarding the alleged human pilot control of Flight 175 is not only at the very end, well, let's scratch that and try again. At 10,000 feet per minute descent rates, the alleged pilot of Flight 175 not only had to contend with severe, potentially G-forces at a descent rate of 10,000 feet per minute, but also apparently applied additional thrust with one hand and maintained control over the control stick with another hand, all under tremendous stress, not only physical, but psychological as well. An implausibility, certainly. In addition, there were crosswinds present during Flight 175's descent. And the fact that the plane hit, as we observe in the video, necessarily implies that crosswinds that were present were accounted for either by the accused, luckily, or by some automation and INS, inertial navigation systems, such as gyros and accelerometers. Again, either remarkable luck or something else at play. During this research and development period that I mentioned earlier, 95 to 2001, traffic collision avoidance systems were new and upgraded, were under development. And this research and development included the potential for removing human pilot control of an aircraft from a pilot who is at risk of a midair or air-to-ground collision, and how shall we say, we'll just stop there with that and expand further. Each aircraft had a transponder aboard, which warned of the risk of potential mid-air collisions with other aircraft comparably equipped. Of all 4 9/11 planes, only one had a transponder that continued to function throughout. That was Flight 175. Flight 175, coincidentally or not, was also the only 9/11 flight that was in jeopardy of 2 mid-air collisions while en route to World Trade Center Building 2. The fact that it remained on actually facilitated its own impact with Building 2 by warning at least 2 other flights with comparably equipped transponders to be warned out of the way, as these units can essentially communicate with one another and recommend escape maneuvers to the pilots. Again, coincidentally or not. Also, during the aforementioned research and development period for other systems, something known as a flight termination system was developed around this time, which allows for the intervention against and remote control of various types of aerial vehicles, be they missiles, drones, or other unspecified, unpiloted aerial vehicles. Descriptions of such that include language like intercepting and intervening against an aircraft's flight control systems in order to turn such an aircraft around for a remote controlled landing at a desired destination. In April of 2001, curiously or not, French authorities noted occasional transponder jamming that they could not explain, which resulted in the loss of secondary surveillance radar data to air traffic control screens. The 9/11 Commission report alleges, without evidence, that 3 of the 4 flight transponders were turned off that day by the accused. But there's actually no evidence for this. It's only an assumption. And however, whether or not, how shall I say this? Apparently, they never did take into account other possibilities, such as jamming by a separate party. But that doesn't fit with the official narrative, so perhaps that's why they never addressed that potential. So again, this is a rather brief presentation, but I think it's provided enough information to make a powerful case for control of the airplanes by means other than the accused, inexperienced human pilots that were identified only within hours of the attacks on the same day.
Thank you, Aidan. I think we've lost Aidan, unfortunately. But again, I think the images that were shown there of 175 and the steepness of the descent and then the rapid pullout and so on really starts to sort of give an idea of what Olivier was talking about in terms of the kind of extreme maneuvers which were being performed. And obviously Aidan's work and analysis of the questions surrounding the GPS and remote control starts to provide a very plausible understanding of what was actually going on in terms of the control of these aircraft, and one which is much more plausible than the claim of the alleged hijackers having been in control. I think now we are going to, if we have Kevin Ryan, we are now going to move to our final presentation with Kevin. Kevin is editor of Journal of 9/11 Studies and author of another 19. He's also on the board of International Center for 9/11 Justice. And it's going to be a very interesting discussion or detailing of the questions over the air defense failures which occurred on 9/11, those air defense failures which would have been necessary for the official story to be correct in terms of the aircraft reaching their targets and so on. So without further ado, Kevin.
Thank you, Piers. Now, are we ready with the slides? I'd like to begin by stating that one of the most important questions about the crimes of September 11th is why were none of the 4 hijacked planes intercepted? And understanding the answer to this question calls for understanding the different conflicting accounts given and the organizations, the people, and the protocols that were in place to defend the skies over North America. Let's start by looking at the flights that were hijacked. Here's a graphic that shows the flight paths of the 4 planes as given by the official accounts. All 4 were set to take off around 8 a.m. on September 11th. The 2 planes that hit the World Trade Center were American Airlines Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175, both Boeing 767 aircraft. American 11 is the red line at the top here, and United 175 is the dark red line below it. They both took off from Boston's Logan International Airport. American 11 was the first plane hijacked, and it hit the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. And United 175 hit the South Tower 17 minutes later at 9:03 a.m. American Airlines Flight 77 was the third plane involved, the Boeing 757. And this is the green line on the graphic. It took off from Dulles International Airport in Washington, and after flying out to southern Ohio, it was hijacked and flown back to Washington to crash into the Pentagon building. United Airlines Flight 93 was also a Boeing 757, and its path is shown here by the blue line. United 93 took off from Newark International Airport after being delayed about 40 minutes on the runway. It also flew out to Ohio, past Cleveland, and was hijacked and flown on a path toward Washington, but crashed in Pennsylvania. The United 93 crash officially occurred at 10:03 a.m., which was nearly full 2 hours after the first plane was known to be hijacked. So we have to ask, what was supposed to happen given the history of air defenses in the country and given the protocols for defending the airspace? The nation was supposed to have been protected by the combined efforts of 2 organizations, the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, that monitors air traffic regions like those seen on the left here. And the FAA's job is to regulate and oversee all civil aviation in the United States and to ensure the safety of civilian flights. On 9/11, the hijacked planes flew through 4 FAA monitoring regions controlled by centers in Boston, New York, Cleveland, and Indianapolis. FAA was supposed to coordinate with the North American Aerospace Defense Command, called NORAD, to scramble one or more of NORAD's interceptor jets when a plane was uncommunicative or deviated from its course. NORAD is the joint U.S.-Canadian military organization charged with monitoring and defending the airspace over North America. NORAD's sector and air bases that were involved on 9/11 are shown in the graphic to the right. Long-standing operating procedures at NORAD for dealing with aircraft that went off course or were hijacked were not followed on 9/11. Each of the 4 flights involved in the 9/11 attacks should have been intercepted when they lost radio contact, deviated from their course, or turned off their transponders. The procedures for interception were automatic and required no special orders to implement. Through these procedures, interceptor jets were scrambled 129 times in the year 2000 and 67 times in 2001, prior to June of that year. Military aircraft were typically scrambled in response to suspected drug smugglers and to visually inspect unidentified aircraft and aircraft in distress. What did NORAD have to say about why none of the planes on 9/11 for almost 2 hours, why they weren't intercepted? The answer to that question changed a lot over the years. The first account was given 2 days after 9/11, on September 13th, 2001. This was when General Richard Myers, who was on 9/11 was serving as the acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in absence of his boss. And he testified that no fighter jets were scrambled to intercept any of the hijacked flights until after the Pentagon was hit. That account was changed 5 days later, and a detailed timeline of events was provided by NORAD leadership. It showed that NORAD did scramble jets from Otis Air Base at 8:46 that morning, the same time that American Flight 11 hit the tower. The timeline also showed that NORAD was notified about the hijacking of Flight 175 at 8:43 a.m., a full 20 minutes before it impacted the South Tower of the World Trade Center. Just 3 minutes after they were notified, F-15 interceptor jets from Otis were airborne and flying toward New York City because they had been scrambled in response to the first hijacking. Later at 9:24 a.m., NORAD scrambled jets to intercept hijacked aircraft headed for Washington. This was 13 minutes before Flight 77 was reported to have impacted the Pentagon. General Ralph Eberhart, who was the commander of NORAD, repeatedly told the U.S. Senate Armed Service Committee in October that NORAD had received, quote, documented notification about Flight 77. This second new account was confirmed in a book written by the U.S. Air Force, and it was published in January 2003. The book was called Air War Over America, and it was based on hundreds of interviews with the personnel responsible for conducting the nation's air defenses that day. It had been reviewed for accuracy as well by all the top brass who were in charge of the air defenses on 9/11. However, this second account was problematic as it raised a lot of uncomfortable questions about why the hijacked aircraft were not intercepted. For 2 years, people were astounded by the incompetence that this timeline represented, because it looked very much like 3, if not 4, of the planes should have been intercepted. On 9/11, there were 3 air bases with interceptor jets available that were well within range of the aircraft hijacked that morning. These included Otis Air Base, as I mentioned, in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and Langley Air Force Base in Hampton, Virginia. Also active with interceptor jets at the ready was Andrews Air Force Base, just 10 miles from the Pentagon. On 9/11, jets were scrambled from all 3 of these bases, yet none of the hijacked planes were intercepted. The diagram here shows that the flight paths of the Otis and Langley jets as they were scrambled, and it shows that they flew in convoluted paths. The Otis jets were instructed to maintain a holding pattern over the Atlantic and to wait for further instruction, and the Langley jets were told to fly out over the Atlantic at a fraction of their maximum speed. And it's not that NORAD didn't know where to go, because in the case of Flight 175, for example, everyone knew where this was because it never turned its transponder off. And the table here shows that there was more than enough time available for the fighter jets to reach the hijacked aircraft, with time to spare if they had flown at maximum speed. Otis fighters should have reached New York City before Flight 175 crashed, and jets scrambled from Langley should have easily reached Washington and or Pennsylvania before needed. So how did the U.S. military respond to the growing questions about why the hijacked planes were not intercepted? In May 2003, Air Force General Larry Arnold and Colonel William Allen Scott presented a slightly revised version of NORAD's timeline. They contradicted the timeline for Flight 175, saying that NORAD was not notified of the hijacking until 9:05, 3 minutes after the aircraft crashed into the South Tower. This was despite the fact that when asked by a U.S. senator about the second hijacked plane somewhere up there, General Eberhard had previously said, quote, "Yes, sir, during that time we were notified." Arnold and Scott also revealed for the first time that NORAD was notified about the hijacking of Flight 93 at 9:16 a.m., just as the FAA learned about it. This was 47 minutes before that flight allegedly crashed in Pennsylvania. 47 minutes. Obviously, interceptor jets could have easily reached and escorted Flight 93 given this revised timeline. Here again is the overall picture with changes made in 2003 highlighted. And although NORAD's problem with Flight 175 was conveniently gone because it allegedly was never notified about that aircraft, the problem presented by Flight 93 notification was much worse. And this was the situation until July 2004, almost 3 years after the 9/11 attacks. The fourth and final story was the new account given by the 9/11 Commission report. The new story was that NORAD was not aware of any of the last 3 hijacked airliners until after they crashed. Instead of 20 minutes notice on Flight 175 and 14 minutes notice on Flight 77 and 47 minutes notice on Flight 93, we were told by the 9/11 Commission that NORAD was not notified about any of them until it was too late. The military was off the hook entirely. All the evidence for notifications and response, which had constituted the official account for 3 years, had been thrown out the window. In place of these documents and testimonies, the Commission made unbelievable claims about communication failures and misdirection of the scrambled jets. The 9/11 Commission's director, Philip Zelikow, justified the new claims by saying that military officers had all been lying about their accounts. Zelikow wrote to the chairman of the 9/11 Commission in June 2004, just a month before his report was released, saying the military officers who gave the third story knew that their testimonies were false before they presented them in May 2003. A month later, Zelikow's new story was presented as fact in the 9/11 Commission report. Another 2 years later, in 2006, this incredible new account was supported by an article in the magazine Vanity Fair. Allegedly, the author of the article was given privileged access to audio tapes that were not previously available to NORAD and would not be made available to the public. Although the claims made by these elusive NORAD tapes allegedly bolstered the Commission's new timeline, credible explanations were never given for throwing out the years of testimony and evidence that had supported entirely different timelines. We were simply asked to believe that everyone in the military had been lying. And not only lying, but lying to make themselves look bad. If the truth was that they were never notified, why would they spend years telling the world that they knew all about the hijackings and were tracking the planes? The changing stories led to placing more blame for the failed air defenses on the FAA. However, the FAA had publicly stated in 2003 that NORAD had been informed throughout all the developments that morning. An FAA communications official wrote a memo to the 9/11 Commission. The memo, entitled FAA Communications with NORAD on September 11, 2001, was sent to the 9/11 Commission by Laura Brown, the head of public affairs at FAA. And it said within minutes after the first aircraft hit the World Trade Center, FAA immediately established several bridges that included FAA field facilities, the FAA Command Center, FAA headquarters, the Department of Defense, and the Secret Service. The U.S. Air Force liaison to the FAA immediately joined the FAA headquarters phone bridge and established contact with NORAD. The FAA shared real-time information on the phone bridges about the unfolding events, including information about loss of communication with aircraft, loss of transponder signals, unauthorized changes in course, and other actions being taken by all the flights of interest. Additionally, FOIA released transcripts of communications by air traffic controllers and handwritten controller notes indicate that the original timelines from NORAD were correct. This means that if we are to believe the 9/11 Commission, we must accept that everyone in both the military and the FAA was lying about tracking the hijacked planes before they crashed. We'll get back to the FAA, but let's have a look here at some of the statements that the 9/11 Commission has said were lies by the military. General Ralph Eberhart told the U.S. Senate in October 2001 when asked by a U.S. Senator about the second hijacked plane somewhere up there, that, yes, sir, during that time we were notified. Now, this is not only lying, this is lying to Congress, which is a felony. Eberhart added that NORAD was notified about Flight 77 coming into Washington at 9:24, 14 minutes before it impacted the Pentagon. He told the Senate Armed Services Committee repeatedly that this was a, quote, documented notification. General Larry Arnold of NORAD said, "We were concerned about Flight 93 and Delta 1989, and we're trying to find aircraft in the vicinity to help out. Then we watched the 93 track as it meandered around the Ohio, Pennsylvania area and started to turn south toward D.C. General Arnold did make clear in an interview with the Air Force Public Relations Officer Leslie Filson that NORAD was tracking both United 93 and Delta 1989, which was allegedly said to be hijacked, and its pilot said it was not. But Filson said that she was told by Arnold and others that they were tracking United 93 specifically, and were also aware of Delta 1989. This is important because some government apologists say NORAD was tracking Delta 1999 when they thought it was United 93, and that's obviously not the case from the testimonies given. Here are more examples of the alleged lying. Colonel Robert Marr, who was in charge of the Need sector, repeated several times in his January 2004 interview with 9/11 Commission staff members that he recalled monitoring Flight 93 during that time. Apparently, he was lying. Need's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Stewart, who was standing right next to Marr during the crisis, reported the same thing. Both of them said that they were tracking Flight 93. And air traffic controllers, as said before, made clear in their handwritten notes and their personal statements that 93 was known as a hijacking long before it was destroyed. General Larry Arnold clarified in testimony to the 9/11 Commission that it was our intent to intercept United Flight 93. I was personally anxious to see what 93 was going to do, and our intent was to intercept it. But we decided to stay over Washington because there was not that urgency. So we elected to remain over DC until that aircraft was definitely coming toward us. After learning that the 9/11 Commission said that these were all lies, all these people were lying, a U.S. Senator spoke out about it. Senator Mark Dayton of Minnesota said NORAD officials, quote, lied to the American people, they lied to the Congress, and they lied to your 9/11 Commission. But of course, the logical conclusion here is not that the military and the FAA were all lying. Instead, the conclusion should be that the 9/11 Commission was lying to avoid having to explain otherwise inexplicable facts. Here are some important facts related to questions that people sometimes ask. These subjects are covered by some papers at the Journal of 9/11 Studies. But we know that Flight 175 never turned off its transponder. We know that Flight 77 never turned off its autopilot, even when it was being hijacked and it was turning around. Remarkable, you might think. Flight 93 didn't turn off its transponder until 9:40, which was 24 minutes after NORAD was notified, so everyone knew where that plane was at. Radar can track aircraft without transponder data. That's one thing that people make a mistake about. The area of the U.S. where the planes were hijacked has no gaps in radar coverage. There was one brief unusual loss of radar coverage affecting Flight 77, but none of the others. And if the transponder is turned off, air traffic controllers can still track the aircraft via primary radar coverage and get the aircraft's location, direction headed, ground speed, and through triangulation, they can get the altitude changes. If the interceptor jets had caught up with the hijacked aircraft, it's important to know they would have seen who was flying the planes, if anyone. So what really happened? Why didn't the systems in place ensure that the hijacked aircraft were intercepted as they usually were? What we know is that a couple of questionable characters were brought in at the FAA and played key roles in the communications failures. We know that military exercises were going on that day, that very morning, that obstructed the response. We know the Secret Service could have helped, but did nothing to help. And we know that the chain of command all went missing. What we don't know is, were the aircraft hijacked remotely and flown using the latest remote guidance technology? The technology definitely existed and was being practiced in the months before 9/11, as described by Aidan Monaghan. We also don't know if defense communication systems were hacked and interrupted. But for my presentation, we'll get back to what we know. The 9/11 Commission blamed the failure of air defenses on a failure of communications between FAA and NORAD. That's why it's important to examine two questionable characters brought into FAA just before 9/11. Both of them were key players in the communications failures. At the FAA's command center in Herndon, Virginia, a new guy was put in charge. This was Benedict Sliney, and it was his first day on the job on 9/11. He came to the FAA from a career as a Wall Street lawyer. Sliney was given the lead in the command center's response to the hijackings, despite several others having seniority. Sliney was first notified of the hijacking of American 11 around 8:15 per his own testimony. This was 31 minutes before it hit the North Tower, and Sliney had plenty of time to coordinate with NORAD. But he didn't do that. Instead, he waited and stalled and did basically nothing all morning. His excuse for not doing his job was that he, quote, did not receive a request to authorize a request to the military for assistance. The second guy is General Michael Canavan, who was the FAA's hijack coordinator, a role that the 9/11 Commission said was the central failure point on 9/11. Canavan had been in his position for only 9 months, and he left the job a month later. He came to FAA from his position as the commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, where he ran the military's counterterrorism operations and covert missions. In the months leading up to 9/11 at FAA, he was in charge of running training exercises that were, quote, pretty damn close to the 9/11 plot, according to John Hawley, an FAA intelligence officer. On September 11th, Canavan went missing, and no one was identified to take his place as hijack coordinator. Canavan was never questioned about it, but he did make a stammering statement to the 9/11 Commission about being in Puerto Rico that morning. But insertion of these questionable characters into the scene certainly helps to explain some issues about communication. But remember that Laura Brown, FAA's communications director, said in 2003 that NORAD was aware of everything that FAA was aware of in real time, because NORAD had a direct link to FAA's system. So why didn't NORAD respond? Some government apologists have tried to use the excuse that no one had ever considered suicide hijackings of airliners within the United States, and the military was just not prepared. But the record shows a completely different picture. The military had been practicing for just such an occasion. NORAD had practiced 5 hijack exercise events between November 1999 and October 2000. All of these included a suicide crash into a high-value target. NORAD had practiced 28 hijack exercise events in the 20 months leading up to 9/11. At least 6 of these were focused on hijackings located entirely within the United States, which puts to rest the excuse that NORAD was only looking for threats coming from outside of its borders, of the U.S. borders. One of these exercises, Vigilant Guardian, in October 2000, practiced interception of an airliner hijacked for a suicide attack against the 39-story United Nations building in New York City, just a few blocks from the World Trade Center. Another air defense exercise called Amalgam Virgo in practice just 3 months before 9/11, was accompanied by a planning document that had a picture of Osama bin Laden on the cover. So the military had spent a couple of years practicing crisis events just like the ones that occurred on 9/11. Let's look again at some of the key players in the military chain of command on 9/11. General Ralph Eberhart was commander of NORAD. He was also commander of the U.S. Space Command. Eberhart sponsored all the military exercises occurring on 9/11. And in the middle of the 9/11 attacks, Eberhart decided to drive between Peterson Air Force Base and NORAD Cheyenne Mountain Operations Center, instead of taking a helicopter as usual, making him unavailable for nearly 1 hour. Almost an hour he was unavailable. As commander of U.S. Space Command, Eberhart was responsible for setting what's called Infocon levels. Infocon is an alert system that defends against attacks on communication networks within the Department of Defense. Just 12 hours before the 9/11 attacks, an order was given to lower Infocon to its least protective level. And setting Infocon at a lower level made it easier for people to hack into or compromise the defense computer networks, including communications and air defense systems. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was Eberhart's boss. Like a dozen others at the Pentagon, Rumsfeld was a signatory of the proposals put forth by PNAC, a project for a new American century that 1 year before 9/11 had called for a new Pearl Harbor to justify expanding U.S. military spending. On 9/11, Rumsfeld went missing for over 30 minutes and ultimately never helped in any way with the defense. Like General Eberhart at NORAD and General Canavan at the FAA, many key leaders just went missing. The entire military chain of command was missing or indisposed. The chain went from President Bush to Secretary Rumsfeld in the Department of Defense to General Hugh Shelton, who was the actual chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was on his way to Europe, to General Montague Winfield at the Pentagon, and they were all missing. General Winfield was the Deputy Director of Operations for the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon. He was the official contact for the FAA hijack coordinator. General Canavan would have called General Winfield if the two of them had not been very coincidentally missing for just those morning hours. And other leaders at NORAD included General Larry Arnold, whose testimony we have seen. He was the head of NORAD for the continental U.S., and Colonel Robert Marr, whose testimony we have seen, the head of NORAD at NEADS. These men were among the many military officers that at NORAD that the 9/11 Commission had said spent years lying about tracking the hijacked planes. And they were also involved in the exercises. Military exercises were occurring on the day of 9/11 at the exact time of the hijackings. The 2001 version of Vigilant Guardian had been in play for several days. On September 9th, it included a scenario in which terrorists hijacked an airliner and planned to attack New York City. This was just 2 days before 9/11. On September 11th, the exercises were supposed to begin at 9 o'clock in the morning. When they first learned that Flight 11 was hijacked, NEAD staff noted that the exercise appeared to be starting an hour early. The evidence indicates that everyone at NEADS, including Colonel Marr, thought the actual hijackings were exercises. They even joked about it. There is no doubt or dispute that the military personnel involved confused the actual hijackings on 9/11 with the exercises. And there's a lot of testimony from people involved that shows it. According to the Vigilant Guardian planning documents, the 9/11 exercise was to be conducted sim over live, meaning simulated hijacking inserts were to be inserted into the live air control system. The exercise was also run real world, meaning the use of real aircraft in live fly exercises. NEADS radar scopes were displaying simulated information at least until the time of the Pentagon attack. The disruptive effect of the ongoing NORAD exercises that morning continued until after all the hijacked planes had crashed. One military newspaper said that Vigilant Guardian continued until 30 minutes after the attacks. Other military exercises occurring on 9/11 included a war game called Apollo Guardian. This was an exercise conducted by the U.S. Space Command, meaning Eberhart was in control of that too. The possible involvement of U.S. Space Command suggests the possibility that satellites were part of what was really happening. For example, being utilized as part of the new GPS-controlled remote guidance and landing technology that the military had developed and had been practicing that summer. Another large-scale exercise being conducted on 9/11 was Global Guardian, a nuclear war simulation. That was a practice for Armageddon, and it involved at least 3 airborne command and control airliners called E-4Bs that are otherwise known as doomsday planes. The E-4B that was seen circling the White House during the 9/11 attacks might have been part of this exercise. Amalgam Virgo 2002, which was allegedly only in the planning stages on 9/11, might actually have been in play that day. Reasons to think this include that some 9/11 commission members were very interested in Amalgam Virgo 2002, and they grilled military officers about it. This exercise involved multiple simultaneous hijackings and interceptor jets that never got off on the appropriate heading, and it took them forever to catch up, just like what happened on 9/11. The U.S. Secret Service failed to do its job on September 11th in several important ways. These failures could only be explained if the Secret Service had foreknowledge of the 9/11 events as they were proceeding. The most glaring example was the lack of protection for the president after it was well known that the country was facing terrorist attacks on multiple fronts. Bush was at a highly publicized elementary school visit in Florida. He and his team knew about the first plane crashing into the World Trade Center when they entered. When they learned about the second crash at the World Trade Center and realized that a major terrorist attack was underway, they all decided to let Bush just sit there reading with the children. This is totally against protocol. Bush remained at the school until 9:35 a.m., more than 35 minutes after he arrived. He even gave a televised speech during that time, letting the world know he was still there. The actions of Bush and his Secret Service detail indicate that they were not worried at all about a terrorist attack against the school. Another failure of the Secret Service was that it did not immediately request air cover for either the president's motorcade as it traveled to the airport or for Air Force One, which took off at 9:54 in the morning. The Secret Service was getting information about the ongoing hijacking events at the same time the FAA was. This was because there was a parallel command system in play, as described by Richard Clarke, who wrote that the director of Secret Service was in the White House Situation Room with him on 9/11 and was passing him information. That information, according to Clarke, came from the fact that the Secret Service had, quote, a system that allowed them to see what FAA's radar was seeing. Documents released by the Secret Service via FOIA indicate that the Secret Service had knowledge of Flight 77 and Flight 93, and that those flights were headed toward Washington. And according to the 9/11 Commission, everyone in the Secret Service must have been lying as well. The Secret Service had the authority to order the scrambling of interceptor jets on 9/11, and the Air Force knew this. Immediately after the 2 planes hit the World Trade Center, staff from Andrews Air Force Base reached out to the Secret Service to offer interceptor jet assistance, but the Secret Service turned them down, saying it was not needed. Much later, after all the planes had crashed, the Secret Service changed its mind, and interceptor jets were launched from Andrews. Let's review the key points made in this presentation. The official account for failed air defenses changed multiple times, and the final account, represented by the 9/11 Commission report, claims that everyone in the military and the FAA had been lying for years to make themselves look bad. NORAD could have easily intercepted at least 3 of the 4 hijacked planes, if not for questionable characters being brought in at the FAA who stalled or stopped communications, interceptor jets being sent in the wrong directions and at low speeds, leaders of the military chain of command all going missing, military exercises in play that obstructed the response, and the Secret Service failing to do its job and failing to help when it could have. These factors are among the reasons that the events of 9/11, which the US military had been practicing, and which military leaders had allegedly spent years lying about, failed to intercept 4 hijacked planes as had happened for years before without failure. So thank you for listening today.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for a fascinating presentation. Clearly, a lot of people have got a lot of serious questions to answer about what was going on 9/11 in terms of the air defense. And I think that presentation really drives that home. So thank you for that, Kevin. And I'll now draw the event to a close. A lot of detailed information has been conveyed tonight from our speakers. I hope it's given people at least the start of an insight into the central problems with the official story regarding the flights in 9/11 and the air defense failures. And then this generates more interest and engagement from people about this important issue area in relation to understanding 9/11. I think there are some key take-home points. Some huge doubts now, or questions obviously, about the authenticity of the phone calls being made by the passengers. Clearly, the improbability of these planes having been flown by the hijackers who are alleged to have taken control of the planes, and also the claims which are made by US authorities about the air defense failures and so on. Serious questions to be addressed there. And I think over time, as we develop the research, and I am looking forward to the work by all of our presenters tonight being developed in the coming months and years, we'll start to get a much clearer, concrete picture of what was going on in the skies. But I think this is an excellent start here for us. I'd like to thank everybody, Dan Hanley for, as it were, introducing the speakers at the start, to Ted Walter, Olivier, Caron-Mason, Aidan, Monaghan, and Kevin Ryan for your fantastic presentations. These will all be available online, I think, very soon, and also broken off into separate presentations. And they all repay, I think, listening to again. There's a lot of detail there, but as I said before, the devil is in the detail. And as with the building destructions that we've come to understand to a very high level of detail, I think we can do the same with the aviation aspects of 9/11. Finally, of course, huge thanks to Mike Robinson and UK Column for hosting us, and for hosting us, managing everything, and helping us get the message out there. And please do, everybody, check out the IC911 website for more information on the work we're doing, and also the Journal of 9/11 Studies. We have over 100 articles detailing aspects of what happened on 9/11. So it's a great resource for people. So I encourage people to visit the website and support the work that we're doing. And on that note, I will say thank you to everyone, and good night for those of you in my part of the world, and a good remainder of the day for those of you earlier in the day. Thank you very much.